Happy Friday. This is a meeting of the Maine School Transportation Safety Commission. It is our 5th meeting, and what we anticipate is going to be our final meeting before we submit our report to the governor and the legislature. And just for the record, we have a number of our members who are coming up from southern Maine, and there was, it sounds like a pretty serious accident that has caused the shutdown of a number of lanes in the northbound lane. So a few of our members are going to get here a little bit late. We have other folks who have joined online. Member Nikki Smith is online. So we could just, like we always do, let's go around, make sure we introduce ourselves and what our role is, and then we will get rolling with our agenda. So good morning, my name is Megan Welter, and I serve as the Associate Commissioner at the Maine Department of Education.
Good morning, my name is Cheryl Latham, and I'm a Transportation Coordinator for the Department of Education.
I'm Wayne St. Pierre, Facility and Transportation Director for SHU 39.
Good morning, Chris Ireland, the Director of Driver License Services at Maine DOT.
And Bob Skeenan, representing Maine DOT, Director of the Office of Safety and Mobility there.
Jason King, Supervisor of the Motor Vehicle Inspection Unit for the Maine State Police.
Debbie McMaster, Maine State Police Traffic Safety Associate.
Chris Rasciuto, Road Transportation for RSU 21, also a rep from MAPT.
All right.
And I'm Bruce Scott, the Troop Commander of the Traffic Safety Unit for the Maine State Police.
I'm going to invite member Mitzi Smith. Also, come on, Mike, and introduce yourself.
Good morning, Mitzi Smith. I'm the Director of Transportation for the Gorham School Department and the President of MAPT.
Okay, thank you very much. As other folks arrive, we'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves as well. Our first order of business is to review the minutes from our meeting on March 27th. Members of the commission received a copy of those meeting minutes in the email yesterday. Do folks have any questions or any comments about the minutes?
Motion to pass that.
Okay, motion to pass, first by Cheryl, seconded by Mr. St. Pierre. All in favor? Mitzi, are you able to come off mic and let us know your vote?
Yes, I'm in favor. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so Jen, we have a unanimous vote.
Got it.
All right, thank you. All right, so the agenda today looks a little bit different than it usually does. And insofar as, you know, in our past agendas, we've tended to say this is going to take 15 minutes, this is going to take, you know, a half an hour, 45 minutes. You'll note that what is included in today's agenda is really an outline of the executive order bullets. So when you see like a bullet with A, that was what is listed as A in the executive order, and they were clustered. You know, our colleague Jen Belanger, who is joining us on Zoom today, has helped to put together a draft of the report, and in so doing, clustered some of the points of the executive order into areas that seem to kind of make more sense, or at least have some commonalities, and has organized that draft report based on that sort of flow of information. And so that's sort of how we're going to move through our discussions this morning, or at least what I was thinking we would do. Certainly open to other ideas. Director Ireland let us know that he needs to step out, and I know that we've had some conversations about compliance. And so if you look down in the agenda when we're talking about current statutes and regulations and any recommended changes or improvements, we got into a little bit of a discussion last week around sort of how are we going to measure and determine compliance as it relates to all things from training, but also one of the areas that came up just ever so slightly last week was in the area of the driver physicals and how those physicals are sort of maintained. Back in 2017, the Department of Education had a rule, Chapter 82, which governed the bus driver fitness determination. And that that was repealed back in 2017 because what was described at the time was that some of what was outlined in that rule was somewhat duplicative of other requirements that were laid out in licensing. And so members of this commission have gone back and have been looking at 82 with some conversations about whether or not it should be rolled into Chapter 81, some of those requirements around physicals, or if we should be looking at reintroducing a new rule to be looking at driver fitness. And that was part of our discussions last week. So in light of Director Island needing to step out, and I wanted to make sure that we sort of move that part of the discussion up first. But before we do, I want to give Director Susi an opportunity to introduce himself. As we said before, we're going to allow folks to introduce themselves if they are able to join.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rod Susi. I'm Director of the Maine School Safety Center, which is a division of the Department of Education.
Sure. All right. So the question on the table is one related to how we are looking at driver fitness. And what Rule Chapter 82 did some years ago is it had a couple of different requirements, and I'm going to kind of let other people talk about that because one of the main things it did that it moved us away from was the use of the medical examination form report. So I'm going to invite other folks who know these requirements a little bit better than I do to summarize what used to be in place, what's in place now, and whether or not members of the commission feel like there's a need in terms of driver fitness that should be included in our recommendations.
So I know if we want to talk about the history of it, maybe Cheryl's best position to do that. If that's DOE
Part of my
history. If you have to way down, you shared with us earlier this week. I think that's running through that first. What we did.
Yep. Basically, it was repealed because a lot of districts that are in rural Maine had a harder time finding doctors on the registry because the doctors had to be certified in order to give DOT physicals. So part of it was that, and part of it was that they had to wait longer to get things, to get this all done. And they thought that it would be easier to take that rule and repeal it so that before the DOT form came out and you had to get the certified physician to give you the physical, schools are now able to use their own doctors, their own medical assistants. They don't have to find a doctor listed on any kind of registry. And it's caused a lot of confusion. It's really a big gray area because a lot of the schools will call me and say, well, what form can we use? We don't have a form. I see you smiling.
We did away with the form because DOE said we aren't qualified to be telling doctors what they should be checking for a physical. So that's when the forms went away. And then they said everybody will be getting DOT physical. Some schools had a hard time getting set up with a place that was close enough that made it viable for them to give DOT physical. So that got repealed. But we never gave any guidance on what has to be in the physical. Whenever they did away with the old form, they did away with the DOT, but they never gave any guidance. All they said is they need a physical once a year.
It's up to the SAU to
make
track.
To make up what you want in that physical. Right. And my district kept the DOT physical because it was just so much easier. We had, 7 miles away, we had a place to send it to.
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you said we kept the DOT physical, does that mean that you had the medical examiner who was registered with the DOT?
Yes.
Okay.
I sent them to a registered place, and they use the regular DOT physical, the same as a truck driver, and it's sent into the state, everything through them. So
I did post the previous one that we had before the DOT physical came around. I did post that online just because a lot of the districts just didn't have a form, they didn't know what to do. And it includes all the vital information that you need to know that someone's helping out to drive school bus. But like I said, it's a big gray area. A lot of schools don't know what to do.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's no, I think to Wayne's point, there's no set standard for the, you don't use the DOT. The DOT, there's a whole handbook, right, that the FMCSA publishes that the medical examiners handbook they go through and they say, hey, if I have sleep apnea, which is a very common condition, right? Here's how long you write it for, right? Here's the thresholds for it. They got compliance for this amount of time. The districts, like I think about myself, like trying to come up with, some ideas on what I'm not qualified to, tell them to take Tylenol or use a Band-Aid. So like the thought of, coming up with medical requirements for a driver, I do the same thing. I default to the DOT exam for that reason. Because there's somebody else smarter than me thinking about what. But to that point, the trouble with the DOT is that they imagine a truck driver that's driving from Maine to Iowa, that's got to secure loads and going to be doing these 8, 10 hour, whatever, pushing the limits of their time service and stuff like that school bus drivers don't normally encounter. So they test them to a pretty high standard on things as well. So
it is a higher standard at the DOT physical than
for sure
what we used to have. Yeah, definitely. It's quite thorough.
So I think the problem on the table is that that there was the standard that folks thought was very high. Sometimes getting access to certified medical examiners who are registered was also a challenge for some SAUs. And obviously then the problem that is on the table is that means there's a lot of inconsistency. And part of what I think we've heard in the commission, whether it is training requirements, or in this case, driver fitness and determining that, wanting to provide some greater clarity statewide so there's greater consistency. So if we are looking at trying to resolve some of the problems that were encountered before, while also trying to, respond to the need for consistency, are there ideas about what we should do or a recommendation that we should bring forward?
Spent some time kind of thinking about like how would we work through this? And I think Cheryl's and Wayne and Chris's comments here this morning, right? The gray area, the uncertainty, I think are probably the closest thing to a problem statement we have. I don't think, not having seen formal NTSB reports, formal law enforcement investigative reports, I don't know that we have any sense that, at least in the 2 cases of last year's fatal crashes, that the driver's physical capabilities were contributing or not. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve with this discussion? I think it's a little ill-defined, and we may learn more as we go. But if we were to assume that the lack of a standard unto itself is a problem, then I would think, kind of look at it and take 4 questions, maybe in this order, right? The first one is, is the nature of school bus operations and the need to safely protect the children, does it warrant a specific medical standard? That's kind of a yes or no question. And then the second question would be, what would that standard be and who defines it? Which probably isn't this exact group of people, but it might feed future work. The third question would be then, how do you document that standard, or how do you articulate the requirement? Is that law? If you wanted to make it part of licensing, you need to park that in law. If you want to make it an employment requirement, you might park that in rule, departmental rule, right? And then the last question is, and then whose responsibility is it to track that, right? What program gets established, and what humans, what positions and organizations are actually following through on that work, right? So that because Cheryl and I, how many times have we talked about this over the years? It seems like every time we get ready for a summer conference, we've got to revisit this because it comes back up as a question for the agenda or whatever. And it is, it's kind of murky, right?
Yeah, so, it is that gray area. Yeah.
But I think, Cheryl, you've done a nice job both in, talking with us earlier in the week and then this morning, kind of laying out the history. But so that was me trying to bring forth this morning anyway, a little bit of a thought on how to work through that. And maybe the answer is, or maybe my get off and turn off the mic comment here at this point is that a body of work the commission wants to take on? And if so, do we do that through the spring and summer? Because it would lead to potential law proposal recommendations in the fall, through the normal legislative cycle, or if it becomes a substantive, Bruce, what's the phrase?
Major substantive.
major substantive rule change, that would also need to hit the legislature in January, right? So if you kind of step back for a minute and kind of look at how do we get there, that's kind of how I'm seeing a discussion. If that's a discussion the commission feels we need to take and wrestle with and a problem to solve, that's kind of how I would see that playing out. We're not going to solve it this morning, but maybe it's something that lands in the recommendation list on the report, Megan, that you guys have already started a great job of putting together, right? So that's kind of my thinking about the thinking discussion. That's helpful.
And schools would need, if we decide that we want to put it back into rule like that, schools would need time to make arrangements, you know,
Sure.
to say, okay, this year you're gonna do this. You know, because I used to send my drivers during the summer to workplace health services to get theirs. So every summer, you know, we make their appointments and then go in. So these schools will, especially the rural ones, I mean, that's where we're gonna get pushback from, because it is hard. Sometimes to find places that are certified.
So just a thought, listening to the conversation, first of all, I would say it is important that we help develop some standardized practices. We recognize that with the curriculum. And now I think we're starting to recognize that with medical. It really is tough to put that responsibility back on an individual district to make a determination if we have some other better standards to follow. And I think the path has already been blazed for us very nicely with the DOT physical. But I've also heard that there are some barriers. Is there a chance that we could adopt the DOT physical and then withdraw those barriers that we feel are making it unmanageable? Kind of like what you've done with adopting the National Congress. You do say, we like this whole thing, except. And now we're using these experts at a national level to provide the curriculum. And we're saying that these are the barriers that make. Would that be something that this commission could at least work towards? And I don't think it's going to be today either. I agree with the director. We've got a lot of work to do. But I hate the thought of being responsible for things that are outside of my expertise. And so we do have to employ somebody somehow that has that knowledge. So that's just my thought.
So to build on that idea, I think what I'm hearing you theoretically proposing is a similar standard clinically, but to be administered and evaluated by a wider group of clinicians.
I think that's the barrier that they were talking about. I didn't hear any more, that a higher standard, but the ability to find somebody that the medical faculty that could meet that standard. So I do think that if we could remove the standard requiring that they are certified through DOT, and so you can use your own doctor, but the doctor's going to have to get some type of medical form or evaluation, similar to what you used to have in Chapter 82, and say this is the national standard, so follow this guideline when you do it, and then they can use whatever doctor they want. But there's somebody else that says it's the curriculum, because I've even talked to a couple of doctors over the years with these discussions who say, I don't want this resting on me either. Yes, I think you're okay to operate a school bus, but I don't even drive one. I don't know what the skill set is. So let's use the expert, the national level that has already made some determinations on what these skills should be at the minimum qualification medically to be able to operate. So that's kind of where I'm.
So as we talked about, I'm sorry, Joe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you think about that CSA and NISTA, NASDAQ, and National Congress. I mean, they all encourage the DOT physicals.
To Chris's point, right? His group is elected, it's just adopted.
Yes.
So that they have a standard being evaluated, but they're not the ones trying to identify and wrestle with the standard. They're just like,
And Bruce, you kind of hinted at it too. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's true.
I think you kind of.
We've been meeting long enough. We can probably.
Yeah. I think you kind of hinted at maybe use the form, but not have to go to somebody that's registered.
Correct.
Yeah. And I think that would be a good thing, because then at least it would be so gray.
Right.
You know, this is the form and this is the form we have to use. Period.
So I think that what I'm also hearing is that none of us are qualified to determine like what it actually is physical fitness. And I'm looking at Bob because that's sort of in your wheelhouse, not to say that you're the physician who's going to decide, but I know you've had some thoughts also about this.
Yeah, I mean, I said in our earlier, no, I don't like the idea of double standards or two standards or I like a single standard. We have bus drivers in Maine that work for commercial entities that are required to have the DOT physical. Similarly, we have people who live in remote areas that have their CDLs for commerce, interstate commerce type trucking, or working for the logging industry. So somehow they are, despite being living in a remote location, able to get their DOT physical certified medical certification. So I understand it may not be convenient, but I don't like a dual standard. I think there are people that are able to get the federal DOT medical certification, both for bus driving, but also for whatever work they're doing in their community, for whoever they're employed by. I just think there might need to be a less of a, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with a lesser standard for certain bus drivers versus others. Because honestly, the kids in rural areas are just as important as the ones who happen to be close to where there are doctors that are able to do the certified. That's my personal opinion.
I think that, to your point, by the way, if we were to follow the vision that Bruce had just laid out, right? So let's copy the federal standard. Now we have one standard, but now you have a shift of a regulatory responsibility to keep that standard fresh and relevant, so it remains one standard. And so I think there are things that we have to wrestle with. Like when we talked about the LD that we worked to tee up for the transportation committee that they've since pushed for the vote, right? We stuck in there this idea that the commission has the ability to invite people to participate. So I think, if we were to put this on our agenda going forward, DHHS get a phone call and say, this is our topic, send who you think needs to be in the discussion to help us work the clinical side of this. And then stay engaged with us as maybe they're not a standing member or whatever. But I think that's how I would recommend we start to wrestle with it, so that we're not trying to imagine things we don't know much about.
A couple of questions I guess I would have about, if we had a similar but different, the non-DOT exam, right? Like, so how would that impact like school buses? Myself, like we're closer to the border, right? New Hampshire, even Mass, you go down to schools where Wayne State, I don't get drive from Canada anymore, but some people do, right? Would that impact our ability, or school bus with that consideration? They'd have to have it, they have some fee developed thing. Would that impact your ability to move beyond between states or even Canada?
I don't think so, because you're still a municipal bus driver executing municipal tasks. I'll go double check.
Yeah,
got a pretty smart chief examiner who used to work for FMCSA. Probably can't answer that question in about 10 seconds. But I think right now, you can take the kids to the hockey tournament in New Hampshire, and I don't think the feds will have that and I at that with or without a med cert, right? So, but let me go confirm that, Chris.
Sure.
I think that's a valid question. We could be setting our schools up to be less flexible by chasing a different thing. We're chasing the same standard administered differently.
Yeah,
I know I go into New Brunswick and Quebec, and they have to have a DOT physical.
Yeah, because the way the Canadian government and the U.S. federal government have a reciprocity for CDL operation, and it recognizes that, say, the Canadians have a similar standard, so they can drive their Canadian rig in the United States and head back, right? So that's one of those, second order effects depending on how we choose.
and I guess the other piece of it is, what do we do to, train our directors to recognize when somebody goes out for surgery or medical issue, right? To get rechecked before they come back, right? So I think the regulations say that it doesn't necessarily validate your DOT certificate, but it's incumbent upon the employer to make sure they're medically fit. So again, going back to me not being qualified for Band-Aids or Tylenol, right? I always send it back to our DOT examiner for, they call it fitness for duty, and they give me yes, I look at the records, and from my medical lens, I have no objection. Because people, personal doctor all the time, I get these things like, yeah, I'm great when I come back to work. And I'm like, do they know you drive a school bus? Do they know the requirements?
I get it from workman's comp, because workman's comp want them to come back on light duty, but they can still drive bus according to them. Well, then I send them not capable of removing a child from a bus or whatever. So, yeah, there is some conflict there.
Workers' comp is a labor, Department of Labor program, so that might be another partner to bring in the door.
So I think I appreciated the 4 questions that you asked, Director Ireland, early on in terms of the framing. And so if we're thinking now about, instead of doing the work of figuring out like, all right, what are the standards? We all agree with what I've heard the commission say is that there is broad agreement that there does need to be a standard established and it should be consistent. How consistent is, I think, still a question. And I think we also want to make sure that we invite people who are experts to be involved in defining that standard. I think one of the other questions that I heard asked was, is it a licensing matter? So is it a matter of law, or is it an employment matter, which could be something that is rolled into rule? And I think what I'd like to do, if folks are comfortable with it, is have the commission grapple with that, because I think that that's where a recommendation could be sort of established.
Yeah, so I'm going to use a phrase semi-flippantly, so don't hold me to count this, but the easy button would be a recommendation to the legislature to make it a requirement of licensure in the state of Maine. Because the system, and I say this as the bureaucrat, not as the transportation director or rowing, right? So it's just, I know just for the sake of argument, the connectivities and the pathways and the system connection, all that stuff already exists. So if you peg it, if the legislature pegs it to the US DOT medical certification standard, then any clinician who is vetted and authorized by US DOT to conduct those medical evaluations already has the ability to get all that and certain information to the licensing agency digitally. And we then, as the licensing agency, work directly with the driver, say, hey, you're due, you need your thing, and that all takes place in the background without the school industry having to own that. Now, would a transportation director want to be aware and probably keep track of when their drivers are due? Probably, but that's I think an easier task than trying to wrestle with the rest of it, or asking DOE to wrestle with the rest of it. But what does that mean? That means that the driver goes long, fails to get their med cert, that the license is getting pulled by the licensing agency until the proper documentation is right. There are implications of that pathway, right? But in terms of kickstarting it and getting it up, that's all there, right? So then we would probably need to think about, well, how does the licensing agency establish, a more deliberate working relationship with the transportation director to ensure that they have some awareness or can certainly get what they need from us. And we do it right now, every week with phone calls and emails. But so I think that's the most straightforward, least creative methodology that exists. To go and adopt the standard, evaluate the standard, implement it, and then create a program in DOE or wherever at the state level to facilitate municipal ownership is a more creative and more flexible path, but a longer, more burdensome, and probably more resource required.
Well, it does sound like we're pretty much all in agreement that there should be standards that are created and followed, not arbitrarily throughout each district. And if there is a framework that exists, not hit the easy button either, but it makes sense to me. What I always fear when we're doing these analyses, what's the unintended consequence? Is it gonna eliminate certain drivers that are otherwise competent and qualified, or are we at that point? And I will say, I know a lot of the 2 crashes, and I don't feel medically there was any issues with those 2 crashes. I don't think this solves that problem, but this is still an important conversation to have and a recommendation to make. And after listening to Director Ireland, the rest of the group kind of all say there needs to be a standard, and we are not the ones that should create the standard. It is prudent to adopt the DOT physical like we had in the past. I just don't know what caused it to fall apart. That's my only apprehension here. But I think we're getting.
I think if you look more broadly at school bus incidents, right, there's a few few that come to mind.
Yeah.
One, Iowa City is one that's fairly recent, and then wherever, Iowa place. There's a few, if we look at it across the nation, right, then how do we prevent that from happening here in the state? I think that medical is a concern of school bus drivers, just because it hasn't necessarily happened here in Maine, doesn't mean that we're, absolved from that issue or insulated from it. So certainly a worthy topic.
Would BMV be able to, would they be notifying drivers? I'm afraid of a driver missing his date and without that notification, and then Chris or Wayne is stuck driving a bus for a month while they're trying to find someone to fill that spot. Would they be notifying them when the physical was, is it like a license expiration? Your physical is due by the state?
It is, and it's generally pegged to it's pegged off your renewal date, but it's a more frequent date than the length of your CDL, so that date's known. And the system doesn't bird dog you if you're behind.
You get a letter. I just got one. Just from my DOT 2 days ago. I got the letter actually. So don't miss this.
Saying it's coming up.
Saying it's coming up.
Yep.
Yeah, and it came about 45 days ahead. So
Yeah.
This is the work.
We do it in-house also.
So I wasn't sure what he was going to say.
I know it worked. It worked. Actually, it works very well. The drivers get them all the time. So I will say that it's working.
We do it in-house. We keep track of it. We give it to it comes to my office. My secretary makes the appointment for the driver 30 days before, the main office keeps track of it. It's sent to my secretary 30 days before their physical's due, and she makes the appointment for the driver, with the driver,
Yeah, there's ways to do it.
So,
Like I've got a spreadsheet that I use, right? That with additional formatting, and I get a little nerdy on it. But there's certainly there's way there's software and stuff that you can buy into to do that stuff. Also, I think
it can be done.
It
I
can be
mean,
done
it's
in-house.
not inventing the wheel.
and it's a reasonable expectation of the directors to do to make sure all the licenses, the medical exams, and or the staff transportation stuff. I don't think that's a burden that it should live in transportation. Quite frankly, that we make sure everybody's.
I was mine all. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just worried, Chris, that for those, it's great, you are a transportation director, but we have a lot of superintendent / transportation / head coach / recess monitor.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of turnover even within that.
And there's a lot that's heard over.
there is. That's true. That's a good point.
When I'm happy to just give myself homework to come back to this commission. If you give me about a month, I could probably come up with some report, but ability to go out to a national survey tool that hits all of the needs of America, 51, including the District of Columbia driver license directors, say, what do you do in your state? And that would give us a sense, and usually within about a month, you're going to get 25 or so. That's probably a healthy survey response if you get half the crowd. But they'll tell you, you can figure out whatever questions you want to ask. So I can work with you guys to go, are these the right questions? Throw them in the survey tool. They all get, instantly email the survey, and then we watch the results come in, and they're auto sorted into a spreadsheet. So, what do you do? With the DOT standard, or do you have a state standard? Share with me a copy of your state standard. Who's your point of contact? We can lay all that out and allow some crowdsourcing to take place, so that when we regather here to put this back on the agenda, theoretically you can see what the rest of the nation is doing, or at least a chunk of the rest of the nation. So I'm happy to give myself that homework if that's something you guys think is worthy.
I think so, and part of what I want to do is I'm going to kind of be a referee a little bit in this meeting, where I'm going to be sort of challenging this group to say, all right, that is a problem for future commission. What is the recommendation for the report? And so what I'd like us to do is to sort of bifurcate our thinking a little bit and say, okay, I love the homework idea, but that's the problem for future commission. And so what is the recommendation that we want to get into? And it sounds like we're not yet comfortable about landing, is it law or rule? But the recommendation is there needs to be a standardization of the assessment of driver fitness and the medical certification or physical that is conducted. That's where I think this commission has landed in terms of a recommendation. And so if we say, well, this is the problem statement, this is what we've agreed, then ergo what needs to happen next. And so the commission will will review what exists in other states to determine the sort of standard that exists in other states, and will bring forward a recommendation for either rule or statute change. Does that make sense in terms of where we go in terms of the question for the report back?
I think that's good. I would add one more affirmative statement. The commission recommends there be establishment of a standard.
Okay.
Period. And then the commission will work to provide a report to the legislature in the 133rd or whatever it's going to be, something like that, right? But that way we're staking out a ground. It's got to be set somehow or follow.
Repeal the repeal.
Repeal the repeal.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're close to being comfortable saying it needs to be a standard. If they go with it, I think we're really close to that. Is anyone saying no to that at this point?
The only thing I had with work health, who I sent mine to, is everybody in the county wanted to do it right before school started. So they were sending all their drivers there and they couldn't get them through before the start of school. So I've changed mine as their yearly, I go on a yearly schedule. So every month I'm sending 2-3 drivers to get there, because I know work health, that was a recommendation from work health that we don't try and send all the drivers in the county to have them all done at once.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing.
We do quarterly, we try to do quarterly groups.
If you peg it to birthdays, you can guess what the expiration date is on your license. Give or take.
Yeah.
So now you're hearing data you already got, and it's a cycle that everybody's already thinking
Yeah,
of.
I went by higher
It
date.
spreads- Oh, there you go, but it spreads it by the year because of the random birthday distribution.
And if you were to go to DOT exams in statute now, it says you have to have an exam once a year, but that's the interesting thing, is you get a DOT exam if you're a fairly healthy person, then they'll write you for 2 years, right? And then you got to know that it's only good for a year when you document it with somebody as well. So that's the other thing.
We worked with work health, and if it's a school bus, they do just document it for 1 year.
But if we were to adopt the DOT program and the DOT certified medical examiner said you're good for 2 years, right? Then you're good for 2 years. Right? That program makes the assessment, that assesses the risk, and it makes recommendations for us, right? So maybe we actually buy less work by going that way rather than setting an arbitrary state annual visit.
Right, and that's my only point I mentioned is the statutes that have to examine that as well, to say, hey, is this 1 year thing still stand if we're having some medical professional say, I'm comfortable with this person assigning my name to it, 2 years or something like that.
Because in that case, DMV is not going to chase the individual down, and you're like,
Right.
and chase the individual down at the expiration of the fence.
Exactly. So and I'm not saying that we should change it or not change anything like that, just so consider, that's all.
I think doing birthday makes the most sense, because most people already have it we all have it for our license, regular license. But also, most hires are gonna be in that August timeframe, the way payroll and everything works, even if they were hired in the spring. So you wouldn't have that backlog or so for just year round by birthday, I think makes a lot of sense.
So then back to questions we had or comments we had on other topics the last week. Does the legislature resource this additional expenditure?
So what is currently in statute is that the expense of the examination is the responsibility of the TSA.
Yeah, the law says we have to pay for it.
But again, I think the commission has the authority to put that onto the table in a wider discussion, so you and I talked about before, right? State requirements, state resources. Is that something that part of our recommendation or not as work?
Sure. Well, I just want the record by saying, after listening to everything, I no longer think it's a great idea to adopt part of the DOT requirement. I hadn't considered the local doctor who may have that personal relationship and is willing to overlook certain things so that they don't put their driver to work. That's what I think I'm hearing, is that the DOT requires the medical professional to also be part of the certification process. They're trained and accepted by the Department of Transportation.
They're audited
To the
they're
FCS
vetted, and then they're audited, and then when they're deviant, they're removed.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, that's also being done by Uncle Sugar. Doesn't have to be done by the state of Maine or Chris Michaud.
Well, your name is there, right? When I pull an MVR, right, it says, this is the person that said this person is medically fit, here's their license number, here's the day they did the exam, so they own a piece of it, right? And I think they feel a little more responsible to it because of that.
I think it's all, I guess it's, I just want to put that out, that's where I'm at.
And they know the law too. I mean, I've gotten calls from schools that want different bus drivers with an oxygen tank on the bus. And no.
So there would be, I mean, I think it addresses the problem statement we started with, which is the need for a standard. The standard is established and it's understood. And so, you know, certainly the other challenge we ran into is the challenge about access. But I think, you know, to Jason's point, I think Bob's point about people are getting their licensing, whether they're driving a truck or, you know, something like that, they have to have those. So in any event, for the purpose of our report, are we saying, so what I think I heard us say is reestablish a standard consistent with the DOT program, and explore whether that should, do we keep it open-ended and say, you know, my concern was saying the commission, future commission will explore whether or not that is to be in statute or in a rule, kind of leaves the door open, and it could lead us to have multiple, you know, legislative sessions before we kind of get rolling. If we as a commission say, no, we are in agreement that the recommendation is that it is adopted in rule, then we know how to get that into place, and it would be something that would get onto a regulatory agenda if it were a Department of Ed rule. But I think that's really the question about whether or not where does it belong. So I think I'm advocating for us to sort of include in our recommendation for the report that it is either in law or that it is in rule.
I like your phrase consistent with, because it kind of pegs the standard to whatever it is clinically, but leaves open the methodology. And I think my sense, Megan, is that we probably owe ourselves some more discussion and analysis before we take the outcome. Okay. So if we're at first blush in the general agreement that is probably the right clinical standard, then however we choose to implement it, that's what we're aiming for, right? You know, the ability to get off the bus and pick up that 50-pound precious package and move it 50 feet and come down the stairs, and, you know, whatever those physical capabilities are, and have the neck movement to be able to check your mirrors and the crossing arm, you know, whatever those standards are is probably the right standard, right? And then the how can be worked. If we give ourselves a deadline, then we're meeting the process for them, right?
I like it a lot. We're making the assumption 2159 is going to pass, and it should.
Fair enough.
But we do have a little bit of time. We know adjournment's April 15th, so we know they're going to have a final decision before that. So we could certainly have this as our conclusion, our recommendation, and realizing that if there was some public outcry or feedback that we received during our comments period of the next 2 or 3 weeks, we could at least reassess. So I like leaving it a little bit open, but I think we're there. There was going to be a vote. I know we're at the I think the physicals were really important.
I can also hit FMCSA. They've got a local office here in Augusta, the federal vote on Western Avenue. And they go, hey, how many certified medical examiners are there in the state? You know, where are they located?
You share what that is, that
Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. They're the subordinate element of U.S. Department of Transportation that governs commercial vehicle operations.
you have more acronyms in the state than we have in education.
Just, if you got a beer, we'll give it more.
I gotta say, Steve, I came over to the state government and I was like, oh, this is next level.
Yeah.
That's next level, yeah.
I'm doing my level best to not use them, so thanks for calling me out on FMCSA.
And FMCSA's website does have the locator of who's registered for their certified.
So, all right, but I can pull that and share it with the commission.
All right, I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna invite Mr. Marquis to introduce himself. He said we would do that.
Steve Markey, Superintendent of Schools for RSU 57. I apologize for being late. If any of you came up through Yarmouth, I literally didn't move for about 30 minutes and then gradually started moving. I don't know. There was quite an accident, I believe.
Yeah.
So I apologize.
Thank you for getting up here. I know it was yeoman's work, so thank you. So I'm going to take us back to our agenda. I'd like to close the conversation about the driver fitness discussion. And once again, to sort of reground us in our guiding questions for where we went. So based on discussions and on a review of the meeting minutes that we've shared for the last few weeks, and then the draft report that Ms. Belanger put together, we want to be thinking about what should be included in the different sections. And again, the sections are largely, certainly we have the sort of the preamble of the report, and we could talk about how we put that together. But the meat of the report is really sort of going through the different elements of the executive order. And so what else should be included in the recommendations of the report, and what should be worked directly, what should be work that's directed to the ongoing work of the commission. That's the problem for future commission kind of work. So those are the questions I'd like us to think about as we start thinking through the different elements of the executive order. And so when you're looking at the agenda, the current statutes, regulations, and recommendations for changes or improvements are based on A and C in the executive order. And so the way it's laid out in the draft report is literally just sort of taking on, first section there is what currently exists in statute and in rule. And then based on the conversations that we had, in our previous meetings, what are some of the recommendations that we need to roll in? As I was reviewing the report, my first instinct was to say, for instance, chapter 29A, which isn't, I don't think has its own heading, but I do think we want to make that its own heading within that section about current statutes and regulations. Sort of summarize what currently exists in 29A. And I think we did have a couple of recommendations that came out of our discussions really in our first two meetings about what recommendations should be included for any changes in 29A. And to my recollection, really the only recommendations that we had to do with what ultimately I believe were sort of rolled into 2159, which is the statute that was passed out of the Transportation Committee and is moving its way through the legislature right now. I'm not yet aware whether or not it's made its way over to the Senate yet for their approval, and obviously it would require the governor to sign. But she has been very supportive of the work of this commission. She's aware that this commission members, particularly Lieutenant Scott, was deeply involved in giving testimony and acting as a resource for the Transportation Committee. So the recommendation, my point is, we believe that 2159 will pass. We do know that the language for related to the funding for the crossing arms was voted into the supplemental package or the supplemental appropriations bill by the Appropriations Committee or AFA in the last couple of days. So the language and also the funds were voted into the supplemental. So certainly now the supplemental has to go and pass both sides of the legislature. But assuming it does pass, the language of 2159 would need to pass, but the money associated with retrofitting buses with crossing arms is in there also. So that's just a quick update. The other piece that is in 2159 is an act that the arms have to be in place and retrofitted on buses by February 15th. So that language also made it into 2159. So were there other recommendations related to 29A that those statutes that anyone can recall that we discussed based on?
Yeah, so at 2304, we said that on a manual door, they would not require the type of system technology that is proposing, and that did not get into the bill. So we want to make that recommendation. Okay. I'll put in a place marker anyway. I was asked that by members of the committee, so that we'll have a catalyst to be able to create that bill probably in December-ish or so, get it before closure.
That sounds like a discrete recommendation at the end as well. So we can discuss it underneath this portion of what have we been working on. But then I think that's a tasked recommendation from the committee. I went in yesterday. It was a great I went in and put some track changes and a couple comments in there, in the live file. One of them was a note under 29A that we only looked at one subchapter of 29A that's related to school bus. There's another dozen or so related elements that we haven't looked at. And so I think it might be worth just caveating that, because if there are other, we didn't look about driver suspensions or qualifications or any of the other things related to the school bus ecosystem in 29A, and that might be what we want to do, but I think if nothing else, we ought to call out that we didn't do it. So it's I don't know that it's fun.
Yeah, it's part of licensure for sure, that we need to report back on.
So I think just, then that's a caveat or a note. And I left you a draft note.
Yep.
And you guys can take her on that, but.
So that sounds like it's a something that would be in the report as sort of a direction for the commission.
Potentially.
So the problem for future commission is also to look at other elements of 29.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we just say we had a limited scope review of it based on the charter of our commission, right?
Based on item C or item, B, right? So we look at those pieces. Yep.
Okay. Other areas that we recall sort of discussing for recommendations related to 29A.
One thing was about the boarding door, not being able to move the bus while the door was open. We were talking about having a section related to a passenger on board or not, so that we could move the bus off the road or something like that, or be able to transit it home or something.
That's in 2159.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
so-
That's right. 29. Sorry,
Done.
I'm confused. That's right. Yep. Thank you.
Those are so great to get it done.
Good.
That's-
Check it out.
Good. Check that. Move on.
Yeah.
Nice.
Good work, people. Good job. Okay, so anything else related to 29A? All right, as always, it's the report. We, at the state, we use Microsoft products. And so I believe I've shared a live copy with everyone outside of the system. There may have been a couple of pickups. If you're not able to see track changes and some of the live changes, please give me a heads up. And because we know some of the review of the report is going to happen asynchronously when we're not all together. So I want to make sure that everyone is able to see one another's comments. And so please let me know if members of the commission are not able to access, see the comments or any of the track changes, and we'll respond, figure it out, whatever manner we can. So in looking at other elements and for our agenda, we're still in the first section, current statutes and regulations. So we also spent some time looking at Rule Chapter 86. Rule Chapter 86 is related to bus specifications and is really pretty closely aligned with some of what was taken up with 2159 as well as 29A. Does anyone have any thoughts about any recommendations that came in related to Rule Chapter 86?
We danced around, we spent a fair bit of time talking about inspections. Jason kind of walked us through that. Does anything need to be added into that chapter beyond the bus inspection itself? But since we're talking about departmental rules, how does the department implement that program? That's usually what I think about the rule chapters relevant to my line of work. Their boundaries and guardrails set at the what we must do as a state agency, what we're not doing. The people that we're inspecting, what they're required to do. So this is a pretty, very thorough list of bus specifications, but is it sufficient from a program execution perspective as a set of rules? I don't know.
What I
kind of talking that out.
What I think we talked about is if we're looking in Chapter 86, my recollection is that we had a couple of areas that were kind of simple changes. One was, in Section 3 of Chapter 86 was just updating it to say we're adopting the National Congress from 2025. So there's that piece of the 17th National Congress. But then if we continue on within Section 3, sub Part 2, I think there was a point that we were going to say meet Maine safety inspection standards as sort of explicitly calling that out. And that's where I think we've got to our decision point around how to make sure that it's explicit about the inspection standard, recognizing that the manual can be updated consistent with whatever changes happen, so that rule chapter 86 would reflect whatever is in the inspection manual. Is that consistent with what other folks were thinking?
Yep, that was my understanding too.
Okay.
One thing we had talked about, and it may belong in chapter 86, was moving forward. So say buses manufactured in 27 or shall have a micro lock, transmission lock system that the doors open and locks. I think we talked about it. I think we liked the idea of it. There was only some warning, some caution that it could lock while in traffic and there may be a problem not being able to move the bus. And then we heard, well, you could at least move it out of the way. That makes me feel a whole lot better. Was the commission ready to make that recommendation in 86 as a specification rather than a statute requirement?
I don't recall that we had landed on wanting to include that. But I want to check for that. I know we had talked about it, but I don't remember that as a decision point. So I welcome other folks to sort of.
I don't think we ought to go there at this point, just because if you get a bus that locks up on the railroad track or something, and you can't, it's going to take time to disable the braking system and the trains coming.
Why would you stop on the tracks though?
Well, if you're
to challenge that thought for a second.
Well, if you're coming up to it, you come by it, you have to back up a little bit. I don't know. There's weird things happen.
They do, and I'm trying to process this.
But,
in my brain going, okay.
I just hate to have a bus disabled, even in traffic or wherever, you come to a stoplight or whatever, a busy intersection, and it's disabled, then you got a bunch of students on, and it takes time to get them off. I don't know. I think about the what if.
But what about the buses that already have them? What we're hearing that with the handicap buses that already all have them is that they're very reliable.
But they're not attached to the door, to the load and unload door. They're attached to the entrance, the rear door for the handicap chair.
Right. I guess I'm saying the technology seems to work well, and I haven't heard of failures when you're picking up a handicapped student that the bus is stuck in that location. I guess I'm thinking about safety and then what's the risk. And if it's extremely rare that you would have a breakdown, but it's far more rare that you would drive the bus with the door open unintentionally. Even a good anti-pinch system isn't going to work if the bus is in motion. You're going to grab somebody long enough to knock them down, drag them, and once they get released, run over. If the bus can't move, I feel really good about that. And we can accomplish it with a park brake, which is required to be used anyway, right? So do we just say that they have to set a brake? Is that better than putting the technology requirement?
Now, right now it says it's a recommendation to set the brake. Maybe we need to move that into.
That's what I'm wondering.
Into
we
law.
all said in chapter, your adoption, you adopt the National Congress. The Congress makes the recommendation. I think that carries the weight. I just don't think we've made that decision as an enforcement mechanism. But perhaps it gets moved up in chapter 81 that as procedurally you shall set the parking brake or emergency brake.
But it takes it, the answer to go back to what you were saying about being on the railroad tracks. It has to do things that have to happen before that system engages, correct? The door has to be open and the bus has to already be stopped. Right. It won't stop you while you're driving, and it won't. So you would have to stop on the railroad track and open your door.
Right, but you do open your door when you come up. When you come to the railroad track, you're supposed to open your side window and your door and listen for.
But before you get on the track,
right? But
human nature says.
Yeah, I've had it happen before that a bus was advanced too far and he opened his door and stuff, and then the rail came down on the front of his bus and he couldn't back up.
Okay.
I just think about them things that.
So I think what
that
I'm hearing you say is like when we're talking about an anti-lock system or an anti-lock system, the idea is we're trying to weigh the need to make sure that the bus to make sure that there's no way a bus could move if the door is open versus cases where it's not operating as you would expect it to. And it then creates a traffic hazard of some kind, whether you're on a busy street where you let somebody off the bus, then you intend to close the door, you can see the door is closed, but the anti-lock system isn't working. What I recall from our discussion a few meetings ago was that the bus will move, it will just jump. And so the driver would be able to get out of traffic, but then it would not be able to proceed really to drive.
If you're gonna do that, we should be able to say that, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So to kind of go back to, what the commission and trying to make a decision, to make a decision, again, like we were talking about on the DOT physical, we're trying to make a decision on a manufacturer, right? We had Cliff here that said that it works good. I had my team go out and we've dealt with it and say, knowing that this question has come up, go talk to these people. Go talk to your guys that you're dealing with, the mechanics. It's a very simple system to plunger on the door. These guys that are having an issue, which is not a lot, they're fixing them on the side of the road in 5 minutes. They pop the panel off, they open it up, they change the plunger, bam, they're back in business. So yes, are they having to stop, get another bus, unload the children, do whatever they have to do, but they're not paying to have buses towed. They're fixing them because it's such
I understand that.
Right. So what I'm getting at, again, I say rescue and reward, right? Like the lieutenant said, but we're now trying to make a decision whether we should use some technology to make it safer, but saying we have these questions of whether it's going to be unsafe when we have the manufacturers that are putting these on buses that have been on buses for a long time that work, right? It works.
In one particular, it will be added as a feature on all the buses on Bluebird.
Yeah.
Right. So they're going to offer it. It just seems, knowing what I know about the crashes, that neither child would have been killed if the bus if the door was open. It just forces that extra few seconds to wait for the door to completely close before a bus can move.
And that's why we're here.
And that's why I think it's important if the technology exists and it's reliable that we make a recommendation. But we can't be so fearful of technology that if it doesn't work 1 out of every 10,000 times that we steer away from it. I think we have to make a tough decision. But if the commission's not ready for that yet, we can certainly say that's to be discussed if 2159 passes. You write your specs for 3 years, so you've got 2 more years with the current specs.
Yes, and yes, but the legislature's going to have to adopt the national standards.
Right, 86 is major substantive, so it will be on the regulatory agenda anyway.
Right.
The question is whether or not we include this language explicitly in 86.
Yeah.
All 3 of the manufacturers that we heard from offer that type of technology, is that correct?
They all do offer a micro lock, but in the past, it's typically been with a handicap accessible, so it worked off the back door. But they have it, it exists. What we're hearing is it works well, and it would be difficult if you purchased it with it, but we also heard do not try to retrofit it. Don't mess with the braking systems, don't add it.
So it would be
I'm just
something
thinking
to,
moving forward.
moving forward,
Yes.
new purchases should have it. I would feel comfortable stating that as a recommendation. Part
I
of the
guess what I'm saying
specification
also
review.
is that maybe not put a pin in it and move forward and say, maybe we need to bring the professionals in. That's what they do, that they know that system, they know the technology, they know that bus and feed off of them and kind of get a grasp and move forward. But knowing what we know with these fatal bus accidents, I have a hard time with not wanting something that would keep a bus station. I go back to Lieutenant and I's conversations behind closed doors, and that's the first thing that we talked about was the bus moving. Like, what can we do to keep the bus stationary? Even if it's for 3 seconds or 5 seconds after, I don't know how it would look. I know that right now, Bluebird, you open the door, it sets the brakes, all 4. Until the door shuts, then it releases the brakes. Now you can move forward. I know it's a recommendation. There's a lot of districts that, they say you shall pop that parking brake when you go to pick a child up. Which brings in, many times I've been to a lot of districts too, because there's manufacturers out there now that have devices that hook to the parking brake that ease, I mean, who wants to snap that parking brake every time it hits you in the hand? It's, then no one ever just pushes it. They lean over and they give it the old shove. So, I mean, that brings in other issues with the driver complaining about the wrist, the hand, and whatnot. But I just think it's an important thing that maybe not to make a decision now, but that needs to be.
I was gonna say, tabling some of this stuff, I think is good. There's a lot of discussion, on both sides, but I'm kind of sitting on both sides of that one. I think that we looked at tides and the red lights are activated, things like that. There are some newer technology, the new Bendix parking brakes that are electronic, right? I don't know if anybody has those in their buses, but it doesn't snap the hands, and there's a lot of inputs and signals. Like, for example, if the seatbelt's not on, it can set the parking brake, right? So I think that some of the technology is already there with the signals that we put into these systems, but I think having somebody that's smart on these systems, to kind of, just like the medical stuff, right? Design engineers on this stuff, there's people that are more familiar with it, help guide us through it. And I think tabling this to a later date is probably worthy discussion, because I don't decide it right now.
So we've got a couple of points. What we're all agreed on is that we want to make sure the bus can't roll if the doors are not open. And there could be some different technologies that allow that to happen, whether it is the parking brake or a parking brake technology, a micro lock, or something else like that. And so I think our decision point right now is, do we table it, or do we say in the recommendations that in the rewrite of chapter 86, that the specifications, starting in 2028, will include technology that prevents the bus from moving if the door is open. Is that too much, or is that Chris, what you're saying you want? Because I think what I was hearing is that, like you're saying, is sort of, we want to look at the possible technologies, people who know this stuff better. But if we can say, what are we recommending? Cheryl's going to need to get cracking on 86. Right. And I don't want to reopen 86 after the commission looks at it later on. So
I'd be fine with it if it was an override system like the door system that we have, on the air doors, you flip it. And then if something happens and it's in a bad situation, you can just flip it open and get off the road or whatever. That's my biggest concern.
Yeah, so that could be built into the spec. And we got 2 years, but I think we need to make a recommendation about setting the brake then for now. That solves an immediate problem. That corrects the behavior. If you have to set that, if that becomes either in chapter 81 or 86, that part of your procedure is you shall set that brake, which I think most drivers do. I just don't know that they all do, because there's obviously a couple that. So if you set that brake, solves the immediate problem. Then we got 29 model year newer for your specs. So we could say that when you redo your specs, it will be a requirement at that time. And that gives us
I like that.
To really think through the technologies and work through it.
Yeah, there's time for us to make those suggestions, so I agree with
Okay, and the training, like, to be clear, like, CDL manual talks about setting the brake at every stop. So like the training piece is already there that, and I think some of the examiners that are looking, when they do a student stop evaluation, if you're getting your license or not, I'm not sure. But it's in the CDL manual, we train to it, and so in theory, you could be tested on that for your license, right? And so like, that's a piece that's already there, that's best practice, I guess, if it's as some sort of law regulation.
It's a recommendation.
It is, it's true, yeah.
At this point, but we should have it in law.
all of the manufacturers, the 3 manufacturers, they have engineers that work on this stuff. So when Maine first passed the law on the anti-pinch sensors, engineers contacted these bus companies. So we can always ask some in-depth questions on what they think technology with the safety system you're talking about.
Right. I'm a big fan of saying that we should set the brake and everything. I can tell you from personal experience and from an incident we had in our district. So I would say that setting a brake is absolutely paramount at every stop.
So I recommend. I really like the work to specifications. I was having a kind of a level of anxiety when there's such differences in buses and we don't have any, and we have one of the larger fleets in Maine, I'm pretty confident. We don't have any birds that I'm aware of. So for districts that don't have that technology, it's going to create some anxiety. I also worry that the retrofitting, just given what Cliff said, I'd be very nervous for districts that they might be seen as negligent, even though they're not being negligent, if they can't get them upgraded to the degree that a law would require. So
I think that's where making the requirement about setting the brake
correct.
until we can have specifications perhaps updated so that all of the vendors have an opportunity to create buses that.
That's exactly what I'd like to see.
And I was also saying school bus encompasses the small buses that have manual park transmissions. They don't just create neutral, set the brake. Like, for example, our localized policy for our district says you'll set the brake at a stop and or put a park as a transmission of that style. So like, you know, we put a law that says you must set the brake, right? Now,
If
like,
you don't have air brakes, you're.
exactly. So now you say, this doesn't really apply to this bus, but it's still a school bus. So that's why I say I think there's some more. I think you said setting the brake and or putting it in park. You know, I think there's some language, and I'm happy to share what I'm going to find with the commission afterwards. If you like.
Well, and I think that just for the purposes of how we're thinking about what's in the commission report in terms of recommendations, what ends up being in chapter 81 or 86, I think that we're going to have a level of generality in the recommendations. And so we can say something in the report to the effect of, in rule chapter 81, the recommendation is that, that the Department of Education will update its rule to reflect the recommendation that the bus is prevented from moving at every stop. And so that could be, you could then get into the minutia of they're not air brake, the park, you know.
Well, we solved it with a simple sentence. It says, when stopping, bring your bus to a full stop, place the transmission in park. If there's no park shift point, place the transmission in neutral and set the park brake if you stop.
And you can get really simple on some stuff like that. I like that. I would actually suggest when we ask the legislature to change 2304 for the manual doors, that we put a statute to 2308 as part of the procedure. But because that can be done in January. It's quick, if not quicker, than your rule that has to go back through a similar process. This, I think everybody would agree to that. I've talked to the transportation committee, say that makes sense. That should be a procedure. I just didn't know that at the time. I made the recommendation for the rest because we said you got to stop. The door has to be open. The arm has to be extended. So adding that sentence in statute would probably fix a lot of my concerns.
So we just added another recommendation back to 29A.
Yes.
Yes, we have.
That's what I think we do. Put it 29A under 2308. Because we're already asking for 2304.
That's a black and white statement. You know, there's no gray to it.
I think it's,
You know,
This was born out of like an incident that was near miss that we worked through, and we had some training for the drivers and spent a lot of time thinking about how can we communicate this to all of the bosses in our fleet, to include even some of our white fleet, you know, the minivans and stuff like that. And they're letting kids in and out of parking lots and things like that. So we want to get training.
it's going to help. Because it's muscle memory. Once you force this, once they know it's statute, and you reinforce it when you're training your drivers, that becomes muscle memory. That's just as easy as setting any other button. And you turn the lights on, you hit the brake, and it's going to be automatic. We need to create that.
And it doesn't matter if you have air brakes, brake,
Yeah,
whatever.
then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I like it. We'll work on the rest for specs.
So, trying to wrap up where we are with 86, we've made one more little change to 29A with the edit for 2308. Chapter 86, again, really relates to uniform school bus state specifications. So in terms of the question about anti-lock, I think we've addressed that somewhere else. Any other things apart? So I mentioned that I had in section 3, subsection 2, adding basically C underneath B, saying that we'll meet the Maine safety inspection standards. Are people okay with that addition?
We'll make sure that we change our inspection procedure to encompass the new statutes, particularly with the negotiation stuff. We'll create a testing procedures where it doesn't exist yet. It will very shortly. And then you're enforcing.
All right, are we comfortable moving on to looking at Rule Chapter 81? Okay, no objections, moving on to Rule Chapter 81, which is a Department of Major Substance rule related to school and transportation safety. This is probably where we're going to need to spend a little more time sort of digging in. We spoke about 81 really at the end of meeting 3, most of meeting 4 last week. And so what we wanted to do is look at where we landed in terms of recommendations. What I had in terms of some of my notes was in terms of the daily inspection for school bus safeties, in terms of pre and post trip inspections, we were recommending an 81, a very explicit clarification that that is not a daily inspection, but instead it is a pre and post trip inspection. So instead of it just like so one time that it would be an inspection that would occur before and after every trip. That was one of the things that I had. Did other folks have other notes related to 81? I know we had a lot of discussion. I know we're all thinking, but I think I would also say, for the purposes of just moving through our agenda, I'm going to rephrase my question and say, okay, we're going to put the question about let's look at 81 on hold, because I think if we go down and start looking at in the agenda, we've sort of hit on current statutes. We'll come back to anything related to 81 because I think we get to the training section. A lot of the changes and recommendations that we had really discussed last week are going to be addressed in the training sections of what was in the EO, and those will ultimately need to be reflected in Chapter 81.
I think that's pretty reasonable. I think the only final input I think I have before I have to walk out here, but it's kind of related to 81 in terms of is I think the commission seemed to agree that the Department of Education needs more bodies to kind of work the overall program beyond Cheryl. You know, we captured that in the notes somewhere, right? Cheryl's primarily been a procurement specialist, right? But there needs to be a school bus team, for lack of a better term, in the department to help the municipalities to keep this program alive, so that it's not solely resting on an ad hoc commission. Or not ad hoc anymore, but you know, right? So I think that's with every recommendation we add in, whether it's 81, 86, and it's bus related, it's driver training related, it's program safety related, that those all conversations point to resourcing.
Yeah. And I want to also try to capture where I think an important point that was made at the very end of our meeting last week around sort of some of that the staffing should and could come out of the Department of Ed. And also, as we're talking about funding for the general project of driver safety and safety of our buses and fleets, whether or not, you know, there's another organization or agency in the state that should be discussed. So that could be something that gets into another general recommendation that could come out of, you know, again, when we look at what was in the executive order, that could be sort of a general guide or a general recommendation that comes out as a result of everything else. So if we're saying there needs to be more training, there needs to be more monitoring to ensure compliance, where does that responsibility live? And I think that's where we sort of landed last week. So I know, Chris, you have to leave shortly here, but if we can talk briefly about training, and then as we talk a little more about training, then we can sort of shift over to talk about who owns that responsibility to ensure the training is, first of all, put together, carried out, and then monitored to ensure the drivers, you know, transportation directors and even students are trained appropriately to ensure safety. Then we can figure out who's implicated. Does that make sense? All right. So looking at the 2 points of the executive order is confirm that school districts have a process to complete on a semi-annual basis, school bus safety training checklists, identify training needs for bus drivers, and mechanism for this training to be provided to all school transportation units. So last week we talked, and then, the next one is about updating best practices. But the best practices, I think, would be for driver safety, but I think a lot of the best practices are going to be related to driver behaviors, trainings, and that kind of thing. So what we did last week is we began looking at checklists. And so I think in terms of a recommendation related to training, is that the Department of Education will adopt a list of training standards that will include at a minimum. And I'm spitballing here to say we want that level of granularity in our recommendations for this report, because it would be a little bit different than some of what our other recommendations are, where we're saying it's a little more general. Thoughts about the level of specificity of what is spelled out in the recommendations from the
Yeah, so I guess one thing we need to decide is, do we want to have all this training before, they are behind the wheel beginning of the school year, or is this something ongoing that we say the districts can spread across the year? Because that's how we do a lot of ours, is
Like a year, 2 hours a month.
Yeah, so at a minimum, the district should, provide this over the course of a year, which I think is very reasonable. I think that's in line with a lot of professions.
There's definitely a seasonality, right? And I think back to my previous, like, before every winter, we would have a mandatory safety briefing on flying airplanes in the winter, because there's just different things you need to think about. When driving buses, it's got to be the same, right? So, and then there's hot weather operations, and there's some different things. So there's definitely moments that you think seasonally there's probably a surge pre-school year open, and then some other ideas. But yeah, I think there's probably room at both.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Because I think most drivers, I'm sure you're that they can participate in that in service in the beginning of the school year. They're training, where you can get some of the big ones, the crossing safety, the blind spots, things like that. Some of the things of information.
I think it's really about setting what the requirements are, and then each municipality or district determines how they're going to implement that, because some don't have the early before school start days.
Right.
So it needs to be in a way that kind of addresses the needs. And also, I think it's critical that it's not, the 16 hours does not include some of the just basic stuff that we talked about last meeting. That has nothing really to do with transportation. It has more to do with procedural elements.
Well, like I have this used to be right on the DOE's website, and it has what training needs, who needs it, and frequency. I kind of like, and I pass this around to anybody that wants to look at it. But I think
That'd be great.
at very least, we should be putting something like this back onto the website.
So I think I want to sort of name at least an elephant that I see in the room, which is our SAUs, our school administrative units, have a long, proud history of local control. And what that means essentially is that, to Steve's point, is every municipality gets to sort of determine how they're going to ensure that these trainings are going to occur based on how they set up what their contracts allow for, whether or not they require their drivers to come in the summer or work at different times. Every collective bargaining unit is established a little bit differently. And so that's the local piece, but the tension that exists, and every time that we're dealing with this, is what we have been asked to do is to outline and establish some basic standardized requirements related to training. And to do that, there has to be money that follows. The only way that we could implicate and tell our SAUs, no, you do have to have those, at least a certain. So if we said there are proficiencies that have to be done or trainings that have to be done before the school year begins, there will have to be funding that follows that to ensure that every SAU, regardless of how they've set up their professional development days have capacity to be able to meet that. So that will be funded. And the point that I've heard made here before is, as we make these recommendations, there's never going to be a time when there's more of an appetite to adopt some of the things that we are saying need to be adopted. And the problem point that we've identified is every district is so different because of local control, because they have sort of grown up around it, that it's really hard for us to require things. Well, we can require if we attach funding to it. So I'm putting that out there, and I want to just say for the record, if my superintendent friends are listening, I know that is largely an unpopular position. But it is one that we have been tasked with saying, if we're going to require trainings occur, we also have to be talking about how they're going to occur. If you're saying this is when they're going to occur and this is what you have to cover, you've got to figure out how we're going to pay for it.
And or provide the materials so that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah.
I'll double down on Steve's last comment, which is, I've seen it's another line of work. 16 hours of training. Last meeting, I think we're all like, that sounds about right? Unless 8 of it is siphoned off for video display terminals, email, phishing scams, and any other list of things, right? So I think that's got to be part of the directive. Is get back to what it really is supposed to be about.
Yeah, that's why I would say that we're not even don't even necessarily be tied to an hourly cap, right? It should be more of a curriculum based
Topic.
topics. Yeah, you need to hit exactly the things here.
The specificity, the 16 hours and 40 hours is spelled out where? I kept thinking of each one, but it's not. It's
This 40 hours, they first get their license. Yeah, it's in one of the rules.
It's in 81, I think. Yeah, and the 16 hours, they're in here. Yeah, they're different.
it's written, not numbers.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
And that's where it's a little confusing too, because the 40 hours too, I think we talked about this one of the conferences, that like, I think the intent is say 40 hours of training before you initially license somebody. But I think the way it's written, it says the new driver should get 40 hours. It's not like, so you can make the argument of like, hey, they went through all this training and they had 22 hours of training. I'm going to do the remainder of that, throughout the year with them, And so like there's intent versus whatever.
Is some of the training driving?
What's that?
Is some of the training driving actually?
So it doesn't really, it doesn't say, and that's the thing. So like, I think we all can come around and more reasonable what they meant by it, but like I said, it's not really specified. We need to get a little more on.
It's like a book work when you're getting licensure, when we were having a course for prospective drivers. Essentially, it was about 40 hours. Book work, behind the wheel work, bus inspection.
With the LDT, you could get 40 hours pretty easily by doing the classroom stuff. And then if you said you're going to do 10 hours of range, 10 hours of driving, you would easily get and probably beyond that number. So that's not hard. And you can lump in some of that, I think, for initial driver training. Some of those things they do the blood work as well. It's important stuff that they have and say, hey, this is all school district requirement stuff they've got. And you usually get that. I think that's very reasonable to say initial training on that stuff. So I think you can get that 40-hour pretty quickly.
Yeah. So to clarify, so the 40 hours that we talk about, I don't know, have we spoken about the specificity of what training occurs in the 40 hours versus the 16? And I think that we're looking at different checklists, but I think for the purposes of Chapter 81, being able to say that 16 hours of in-service training, annual training related to school bus safety and student safety on buses will occur each year.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So we just update the language so it's really clear that 16 hours must be about student safety or transportation. That way, if we create checklists and say these are all things that need to be included in the curriculum that the department is going to design, you have to use those. So that means that SAUs that have always built in all of the other requirements are going to need to find other times for that. So we've got to be really clear that the money has to follow. We have to create the time, which means the money, to be able to require this is the training that occurs, because we are bumping at least 4 hours of other training for these drivers to have in some other ways.
40-hour thing is up to interpretation. We look at it different ways. It doesn't specify what the rule is.
I think that's why we talk about developing curriculum at higher levels so that it's consistent. You can be trained the same regardless of where you're at. You should have some standards. Now, there can be effective training. We recognize that there's still some local control that can happen and they should figure out that they have something different. We do this too, but it has to be consistent. Done it with everything else. So this curriculum, the training curriculum has to be standardized. I think by the commission, this level, push down. But if, again, we're going to make a recommendation for a mandate, then we have to fund it. You can't have unfunded mandate.
I think that really comes back to Chris and the extra support at the state level. Really, one of those individuals that he referenced could be the all things safety and training. Because it's hard to do it with piecemeal because we all view the center of this table through a different lens, right? But we have to have some consistency statewide. So if there were an individual that really did have the requirement of looking at it statewide, getting information from transportation directors and all, and then facilitating that professional development, it would really move us forward rather than fly by the seat of our pants. Different people jockeying that work.
And I suspect that the 40 hours predates the LBT, right? And so now you have the LBT that's out there that is standardizing training that people are getting, right? And so I think that the language could look to say something like, that they obviously meet all the LBT requirements for licensing. Then if the state wanted to say, based on some of the issues we're looking at here, right? Like safe crossing of children, the operation of your door, things like that, the CPR, whatever that is we wanted to put in there. I think that's more what that language should look like, satisfies all the LBT requirements plus the basic minimum training of, and we decide what those few things are, and I'm guessing most issues are probably doing that already as part of their training. They're out there learning how to, pre-trip the bus, do all this stuff. They're talking about crossing the kids.
Yeah. The thing is, we got to get curriculum that's the same statewide. Somebody's got to build this curriculum or go in and has curriculum in there that you can adopt or whatever, but we need to be trained in the same activity as we are in Fort Canada.
Exactly. And that's the problem with just giving the hours, I think,
right.
40 or the 16 is that, as we talked about before, that could be on any number of things that is irrelevant.
So again, we've got the problem for the future commission, and we've got the problem that we've got to resolve in terms of how do we articulate things into the report. And what I would propose that we put into the report is that the Department of Education shall, this was part of what we talked about last week, shall contract with individuals and organizations who have expertise in, school bus safety, student transportation, and highway safety or whatever the organization, to create minimum training requirements and the minimum training curriculum, the actual what is being taught. And that training will be provided in order to meet the entry level requirements as well as the ongoing minimum training requirements. So it's kind of a general one. We know there's going to be a work group. And then we can also add, and funding will need to be available for the purposes of the curriculum design and review. And then another sort of recommendation for the report is really about the Department of Education. This is where I want us to kind of talk for a second, because I think we want to think about what's the mechanism for the training. Does the Department of Education have the responsibility to employ trainers who then train the drivers themselves, or are they training the directors? What is our best mechanism to ensure consistency of training across the state, which was, I think, part of what we wanted to get.
I would think the most efficient way would be if there are modules that are consistent statewide for certain aspects, And then I think it's actually the directors themselves or members of their team that would be it. I'm not sure how well it would work to have a bunch of folks skating around the state, going into a district, giving a little bit of,
They would love us.
yeah, I don't think that would work as well.
We do this already with like some of the Alice training and stuff, like train the trainer type stuff, right? And I think there's already some models out there of how you do this. And so to your point about, contract with somebody, if we can develop what our requirements are for an RFP for something like this, right? For a company to develop a curriculum and a train the trainer course, right? And so then you get people that could be qualified in this, maybe throughout different regions or something. And so it's a little easier for them to access. They don't have to travel, to wherever, Bangor every time, to get it. It has to be accessible. But I think we can come up with some pretty good thing to outsource this in RFP and say, well, trainer program. That'd be far better.
Well, I know at Maine PT as a organization we did a lot of work back 10 years ago and trained the trainer.
Yeah.
And
And that can provide a venue though too,
Yeah.
like an annual conference, right? You could have maybe, a class on training the trainer or something like that. So there are some different venues that maybe throughout the year that you could leverage and your pull on that. But I think establishing something and then figure out how we get that to everybody, obviously, is, look at study or different mechanisms for getting it to everybody. For sure. I think that's a piece of it that we should consider how we leverage that piece.
But I think you hit it right on. It has to be a variety of different ways. Some folks would like to have someone come and talk to them. Some folks would like to have a regional training. Some folks are fine with doing the modules online. Yeah, I think or different ways that you can get that message out.
Yeah, and I think reasonably, if you had some trainings that you get a trainer, like for example, Augusta here, right? So we're going to do a class here in Augusta. Really most of Southern Maine and some Central Maine, right? It's not too hard to get somebody to Augusta. And so sending somebody an hour and a half to, school bus for their vehicle to get a training here during a break or something that might be an option. So I think that, it doesn't necessarily have to go to every school district. You can get,
you could regionalize it.
centers of excellence. Get to
And then just have that list of regional trainers that you can coordinate with that. Makes it a whole lot easier. So I can reach out to Wayne and find out who's available in that area, because it doesn't have to be your district. If you only have one person who's serving 15 roles and they can't do it, send your driver to the next district over and get that training.
Well, in a district that only had one driver, and a part-time superintendent, they can go to the regional training.
The Maine Safety Center has coaches that will go around. Rob, you want to speak to that? Maine Safety Center has coaches.
So we have created this program for law enforcement, for behavioral threat assessment, for restorative practices that we already use, doing exactly that. Coaches that will go to regional trainings and be online modules. So it's something. It's a program that we've already set up that we already use in 3 other. So I think that there are folks that could do it.
I do think, and I've thought a lot about that model, and it is, it's highly effective when we think about the science of implementing new things. You need buy-in from the people who have to learn the new things, but then you need consistent sort of like refreshing, because you have implementation drift that happens after, I spent 5 years, I've been doing it this way, well, it turns out I got more pieces or whatever. So the thinking that I think is a little bit different in this is I do think we are going to have to really do any kind of train the trainer is going to have to go to our directors. I do think that certainly the department could, certainly be on hand to train drivers directly. But I think the availability of the drivers is always going to be the challenge, where in a lot of the other trainings, school can release folks to you have release time, early release time, and that kind of thing, where you can have many people trained all at once. Every SAU is so different in terms of how they contract with their drivers. And I do think that the elevating sort of the responsibilities and sort of establishing some consistent requirements for directors, transportation directors, makes sense. And yes, I understand that not every SAU has a dedicated director. And that's something that we need to also call out in this report. But I think, I don't know how reasonable it is, just knowing the different work that I've done with drivers in particular. There's the relationship with your drivers matters, and having somebody, a beloved bureaucrat in the state, come in to train drivers may not have as much credibility as their own director or someone who's a little bit closer to home. And so that's the piece that I think when I think about a train the trainer model. I think there are certainly a number of drivers in the state who absolutely would be phenomenal trainers. And so they could absolutely be people that we would say, you know, that a district would be like, you'd be amazing teaching this. So you're a former teacher, you're a retired superintendent. We want you to be one of our trainers. You got a lot of credibility with our drivers, so we're picking you. So whether it's a director, but I do think in the same way we do it with some of the programs that the Maine State Legislature does, the district identifies a few people who will be the leads for training their folks, and they get to decide.
So as I listen, I keep thinking about the conference, the school bus conference. And so many times I've been there, and I mean, it's not practice, the drivers that go. And it's the same ones year after year after year. And I'm just throwing it out there for the sake of conversation. Is it mandatory that within a certain amount, like every 5 years, within that 5 years, you have to go to that conference because there will be training. Now I'm looking forward and saying there's training there. Do you make that training more robust? So they're getting that. They might not have to go there. They go there once, and then some drivers are going to go every year. Some are going to go and do their 5 years. I mean, it's just a thing to throw out there to say, you know, it's there. There's lots of money spent.
That's why it's so important to have those different, because it is, it's
It's
a funding thing.
It's a funding thing, and I'm not sure when those conferences are, but if we want to send teachers to a conference, we can do it because we get some subs. I believe that the state is already probably inundated with parental complaints because of driver shortage. It's a requirement that we're transporting. You're not transporting, so superintendents get calls from parents who are upset, who then go to the commissioner, for example. So the training really can't be during the school year when kids are in session.
So the conference is during is in August.
But then the challenge is
July.
April, the two.
I mean, it's
so the regional, and those are actually during like April break, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's really about the funding. What is it gonna cost? So maybe that's a component right at the end of the school year or the beginning of, start of the school year, where we have the state support one additional day. And all folks, and maybe there are 3 or 4 different regional conferences, because you're not gonna take a bus of folks in Kittery and drive them up to Bangor. It's probably not likely.
We do that now. The MAPP does have regional by region, like the one in northern Maine is at Fort Kent this year, and it's not till July or June, later 28th or something like that. After school gets out. The problem is with the schools is a lot of these drivers are only paid on school days.
That's where the
So
funding
to
is.
get your drivers to go to a training conference unpaid isn't happening.
Correct.
So the school is absorbing costs to send them, and if it's not built in the budget or if it's just not there, then they don't send them.
And there's some contractual obligations, I imagine, for some schools too, where it says, you know, they at those times, you know, because I know in ours says that they work all super days, you know, so somebody could come back and say, hey, listen, you know, that's not, they have not a hard to beat it for my contract, so whether they pay me or not,
I keep, and again, I'm walking through a different lens, but I keep hearing we'll put a price tag, and I understand
Yep.
the problems that come along with it and getting the funding and everything, but I feel like we keep putting a price tag on the safety of children.
Well, and I think, we can be reductive and save like that, but I don't think that's what we're trying to do. I think what we're trying to do is say, all right, if we're thinking about recommendations, if we do say, all right, you have to attend a conference, well, those conferences are not 16 hours. The conferences are generally 6 hours of training if we're being generous. And so that would take care of 6 hours of training. Okay, how would we, because that would be part of the recommendation, how do we pay for that? So are we paying for the conference itself, which we know would be tens of thousands of dollars for the conference itself, but it would also be paid for the time of the drivers. And in some cases, they may also need mileage, they may need lodging. So there's that. I'd like to consider for the recommendation of the report to be a yes and, to be, you're responsible for these 16 hours. And the department is going to contract to create a curriculum that is going to be something that drivers can get asynchronously through this, and that they do this. They may also satisfy 6 of their hours in these annual training, and then may also get another 3 hours in the regional trainings that occur, or the regional trainings that also another 6 hours.
The regionals are 6, and then like the annual is probably,
for one state now, you probably say,
Well, it's 2
multiple
days.
so 6
Multiple
hours a
days.
day, so take 12 hours of training.
12 hours there.
So we could spell that out, and then we've got to figure out a price tag associated with it, and we've got to be really clear and direct about it. Say creating the modules is going to be there, but I think the other part that was brought up last meeting was, where do we distinguish between, this is now the compliance side of things, what is skill based that they have to be able to demonstrate proficiency for, and because the concern was just turn on the modules and then they just kind of roll. And so we could actually do the sort of just check for understanding. Same thing kind of occurs, at a conference. We assume that people actually, when they go to the conference, actually show up for their sessions. But that would also be likely, the way we do it at the summit for teachers, is that they scan a QR code when they come into the room, and that goes in to basically generate the contact hour certificate that's necessary for the certification. And so that level of compliance would also be with everybody. Again, that's a price tag. So I know we're kind of shifting between how granular is the recommendation, but I do think we're going to need to get pretty granular when it gets to the training, because we are going to have to put a price tag on it.
I think there might be, just thinking about the regional service centers that the state has really supported at a pretty high level. Essentially, groups of districts work together for cost-saving measures, and the most common would be, say, paper products and custodial products, but also teacher professional development as an example. So maybe if there's a supplement added to the regional service center funding per district, maybe there's a way to do a regional in each of those service centers heading into the school year. So, you like in York County, you'd have kind of the 9 districts that are part of it. Cumberland County has the same sort of thing. There must be some regional service centers up north. I know Bangor has a big one. It's the Penquist Service Center. So
do we know if the regional trainings that are done, if they're aligned with those regional service centers?
Probably not.
They're not currently. They're not currently. But we do, like in March, most southern Maine districts are doing a professional development day in March. In next year's calendar, we'll have one the second or third Friday in March. Is already kind of in the works. If the state were to support through the regional service center format, you might be able to do an 8-hour training in regional areas where you're bringing drivers together, no different than the way we do it right now with teachers.
Are all schools required to be in
A service center?
Yeah.
Well, they would want to be, not all schools are in service centers or districts.
I know my school is not.
But there's significant financial resources to the districts that are. I like,
So I think what we're talking about is a menu of recommendations.
Yes.
So if we're talking about how to fund training, we're talking about the need for funding the conferences. Need to also fund the time for the drivers, but also if we can also provide another avenue for the regional service centers to offer some of those trainings. Then I guess the concern I would have is, or here's I guess the role that the service center plays in this is that I'm trying to figure out, I don't want to get competitive, and I know MAPT does so much of the regional trainings, but I'm trying to figure out if then essentially the regional service centers and the SAUs who are associated with those centers say, we want all of our folks to go at the same time because we've aligned our calendars, we've done all this other work, then they could work with MAPT. MAPT may be the ones who actually are carrying out the training and then would get funding from the service centers to address that opportunity.
I think any of that would work. And, but it just pulls together groups. And the vast majority of districts in Maine, you'll see it on your ED 279, your funding documents, it will say regional service center adjustment.
Yep.
So, and it's based on student enrollment, those sorts of things. But the state really provides several $1 million for that kind of collaboration. But maybe it would need to be an adjustment upwards, but it would be probably an easy mechanism to put. And it's not about the money. I just want to make sure if
And I don't mean
we want safety, sure, and we want people to attend. But there really are districts that don't have staff work a minute beyond the student's instructional day, but they're never going to get that training at a real quality level.
And I think some of that comes from as many districts I've been at and at the regionals and at the conference is the same drivers come up and they're so frustrated. Like I come to this for training and then I come from my district that these drivers never go. And they're the ones that should be coming here. They're the ones that need the training. And there's no mechanism to make them go and get any training. And at whatever level that comes at, they need training. We don't get to that, but that's kind of where that comes from. And it's already set up. The platform's there. It's just kind of embrace that platform. It's already there. And
What I like is we've agreed that we're going to set a curriculum.
Yes.
And we're going to try to find a way to fund it. The devil's in the details, understand that, but oftentimes you have to create the standard and then everybody else has to figure out how is this going to be implemented? Because paralysis by analysis will take us over if we try to figure out how we're going to implement the rules once we create the rules. When I create rules for the inspection program, I figure out how each technician is going to get this message. I have to create the rule and then it filters through. And it doesn't usually work itself out, but we definitely need to recommend funding. And that will solve so many problems. It doesn't cover it all, but create the curriculum. There's opportunities for training. We have to fund the MAPTA conferences. I mean, somebody who's sitting here listening, I don't even understand how we never have. As the state of Maine, how are we requiring training and not at least supporting that opportunity? So that's a big deal. If we recommend, we fully fund 3 conferences a year, 4 conferences every year, that would at least get them thinking along those lines of how do they get this in their budget. It's going to be projected out a couple of years. It's not going to happen today. And once we get the wheels turning on the budget, we can start to figure out how much money needs to be set aside for paying. And I don't know how you assign it, where it's different for every driver, every district, the rate of pay. So is that a reimbursement? And the districts afford to pay to send somebody, put it in their paycheck and seek reimbursement? Or are we talking about some type of funding that is paid directly from the state DP? Because that's a challenge.
That used to get quite a bit more money now.
a rough thought on, at Maine DOT, we have the local road center, which offers technical assistance and training opportunities regionally. We also have something called the Road Scholar Program, which allows for individuals to take a variety of courses that are offered over time and be recognized as a road scholar. It's kind of our own little degree, so to speak, at which point publish that on the website. Something similar where you have people that perhaps can be a potential trainer, certified trainer for this new curriculum that's being developed, and publish them and make their qualification available and be able to be seen by those that perhaps can't send all of their employees somewhere, but maybe they could work a deal with this individual who is a certified trainer for the new curriculum, or the district that they work for, if they're an employee of the district, that could come on a particular day when all of those, and do that in service day. So those folks could be potentially shared. Not every district need to have their own trainer, but you could, within a service center, have a couple that could rotate around. And I'm sure that within your service center, you have discussions on how to coordinate all of those resources. Similarly, it could be done that would allow those districts that want to be their own thing, and they could have their own trainer. But if you want to share resources, that would be available too. Similar, my wife's a nurse. She is actually a nurse educator. She is certified instructor for American Heart courses, but also the Red Cross also has different certification courses. So it sounds like we're really creating a trainer certification course that could be a very similar thing. You issue a card, that they could then use, but those generally have to be done, they have to be associated somehow with an organization, with a practice, in order to actually get to be able to hand out the cards. Just an idea of something, maybe it's not at this time, but how that could be applied in practice, that certification program for instructors that could then be shared.
I think all this is really good. I think though, trying to keep it, realizing we have nothing right now, right? We've got to crawl before we run, and getting into accreditations and all this stuff. I love the idea long term of that, is getting a curriculum out there. Because I think that if you talk amongst directors and people that fill that role, they're hungry for something to fill the void. What should I be teaching people, or what should we be, putting into these 16 hours, right? And I think getting something and further developing that as time goes on is awesome. But I think we need to look at the quickest option to provide a solution to people that they can start following a curriculum. And so, when somebody asks the question, what are we doing to train our drivers, we will follow the state curriculum right now. And I think that the outsourcing thing we talked about is a quick way to get it, and also might allow some hybrid options for those districts that don't have opportunity to travel and stuff. Because most districts, I imagine, are doing a lot of hybrid already for some of the other all those we keep talking about, the videos and stuff that a lot of districts do. So they have a mechanism to get that to people. And I think there's some real options for that.
I think it's about treating people like professionals, right? And I've had many conversations with drivers over the years, and they'll say, I was never really trained on how to deal with a student who's escalated. That's probably one of the greatest concerns I have, is that creates a real safety issue. If a driver can't watch the road because they're watching kids in the mirror. And we also have to realize that many of our drivers, depending on their districts, they don't have 40-hour-a-week jobs. They have split shifts. They'll do 2.5 hours in the morning. They might work as a custodian in the middle of the day or serve lunch, or they go home and then they come back for 2.5 hours. They don't work days that students are not in session. So how are they ever going to get the training? So we really do have to think about, how do we treat them like professionals and give them the support they need? Because many of them truly show up the day before school starts. They're at an opening kickoff breakfast, They run back to the garage, right, the bus barn to connect with everyone. They look at their bus, and then the next morning, they're transporting first graders, and then the day after, pre-K and K. There's really no true, it's a really tough job.
And I think that I'm now sort of taking on sort of like the devil's advocate to say like, okay, if we're gonna say we want to make sure that every SAU, in my head, I'm now getting into details of, okay, how much money would be recommending. So we're talking about the conference, but every SAU is still responsible for 40 hours and 60 hours. And that's been in rule. And so we could be fairly asked, well, why would we need to add money when the amount of time has changed? So how have schools been doing this already? And that gets us into the compliance conversation. But certainly, I think we want to say, as we standardize what has to be trained, we're going to provide different opportunities to do it. But I think some could argue, well, why wouldn't you just give the trainings to the SAUs and have them make their drivers get through the 16 hours the way they always have?
Well, the difference, I'd say one notable difference that people don't necessarily think about is 15 years ago, you didn't hear about driver shortage. You didn't hear about bus route cancellations. People are not entering the profession, and the average age of our drivers has escalated, and then they're also dealing with medical issues. So it is a vastly different world today than Mr. Marco, my bus driver all through school, who was, he was a committed bus driver, and he had been one forever. Now, there's such drastic shortage. One of the things I think needs to come out of this commission is a real active marketing campaign to get drivers in the state of Maine, because there just aren't drivers. So I agree with you fully. It's in statute. Why aren't you doing it? It shouldn't be coming back for more money.
But if one of the recommendations is that we have to professionalize this as a career path that is a meaningful career, then we have to make it a livable and a workable career. And so one of the recommendations, and I say this with care, is that right now, transportation, including the cost of drivers and everything else, is a part of the essential programs and services model, which is, we currently have a bill to make some pretty significant changes, the first time in 21 years, I guess. And so it has not been easy to model. So if we are going to say as a recommendation that the commission recommends that the Department of Education examine how transportation is funded such that and it's not exactly the same in terms of the salary matrix for drivers, but that we look at how we are paying drivers and begin setting minimums for drivers in the state. That's something that certainly, again, could be examined, and we can write that in a way that could become part of the MEPRI survey, which is the organization associated with the university that does a lot of the research every year to look at our funding formula, see if it's adequate. So I think that would be something that we do. So if we are talking, I guess I feel like what I'm hearing is that we've got kind of a two-pronged problem. We've got the problem of we've had trainings that have been sort of offered and folks can attend voluntarily. And so we're going to tell people you have to get this list of skills and proficiencies sort of learned. And we need to fund that. And then we also need to say, but we have an aging workforce. We have had a chronic driver shortage. To address that, we need to look at how we fund and bringing up the standard of pay to a more acceptable level that will allow this to be a meaningful career.
So we recommend a recruitment and retention study to be done by the Office of Labor Relations or somebody that typically does those. And your devil's advocate position works well for me. I like that. We like to be challenged, but I think what we're going to say is if we are going to now regulate the type of training, so as we create the curriculum, create stricter standards, there will be a financial burden and hardship to a district who was able to do their own in-house training, who's no longer able to do that. If you could take 14 hours of basket weaving and throw in your harassment policies and how to use the phones and how to use the computers and how to watch for spam and spyware, and not really address the driving concerns that we have. So if we're going to say that is no longer allowed and you're going to have to push them into a stricter, more professional type of training role, that's why we have to fund it. Because right now there is no financial way for the districts to send these drivers to the conference. So they're not getting that training. The schools that can afford it are getting it. They're sending them and they're funding it. But what about the ones that can't? We're going to require it. That's when we have to start paying for it.
I think your attendance numbers show that the conferences with the great dwindling off after COVID. There's a lot of people that will say, I just can't afford a hotel room now. You know, the great increase that everything costs more, fuel, hotel rooms, all that stuff. So yeah, that's to the funding point.
Yeah, we have to remove the financial barriers that we're going to create, because right now you do not have to send anybody. As soon as we start to say you're gonna, then there's a price tag for that. So funding the conference, and maybe we fund all the rooms. Maybe that's part of it. Is you have to anticipate what location, and you pay for the entire location. The state of Maine says you're going to have these 3 trainings a year. They're going to be at these locations, and we are going to fully fund the cost of the training and the salary of the drivers. And if we can work out what we think is a minimum model, then at least we could put that forward. And I don't know what the minimum driver pay should be. There could be a recommendation from us that you have to at least cover their current salary.
I think you could do rough math and say $25 an hour times 8 hours, the $200 minimum. But in some districts, it's going to be more than that because of payroll and everything else. In summer, are going to be a little bit lower. Because we also have to realize many of our drivers have a different job in the summer. They're driving dump trucks, hauling materials. They're working as custodians. So why would they head off to a training and jeopardize their summer employment?
Right. Because
we need to make sure it's part of their regular employment.
But I just want to get clear. So what I thought I was hearing Rob say earlier was, you know, if we have multiple avenues to be able to demonstrate proficiency or skill, it doesn't mean that everyone has to attend the conference, but we need to build an adequate amount to do that. So the training is required. We will build modules, and there will still be the training of directors to ensure that they're actually doing some of the driver checklists just to make sure that they're showing proficiency. But then that gets into the competency or the compliance. And so I'd like to spend, I know we have a little bit less than an hour, talk a little bit about compliance and who owns the compliance responsibility. I think we've landed in terms of training that we've got language to make sure that we are, identifying basic minimum training, that the Department of Education will contract to create the training, and then that there will be also regional trainers that will be trained as well. Conference will be paid for. This commission believes conferences are critical, but both the statewide as well as the regional, and those need to be paid for so that you reduce that barrier. And then, I think whether or not we talk about the future commission will explore whether or not you sort of certify trainers of the new curriculum so that they can actually be those sort of regional trainers. And then I like your language, Bruce, about, look, we have to acknowledge that there's been, as we regulate the training, that will create a hardship. So that will have to be there. And then we can start to think about the $25 an hour, or if we even bump it up, say roughly $30 an hour is what we should be thinking about when we're talking about other things. And then, times 16 for each driver is where we might be needing to look at. So then if we look at compliance and how we ensure that's really happening. Right now, the way that we sort of measure compliance is that part of one of the reports that transportation directors must submit and superintendents must sign off on is that, how many drivers do you have? And did they attend all the trainings? Which trainings did they attend? And then the same report is also, did you train all of your students? How many students do you have? And generally what we see when we get those reports is they look at their total enrollment, they multiply it by 2 and say we've trained all of our students. So we want to talk about how compliance of driver training, director training, and student training is managed. And so again, problem for us today is coming up, what is our recommendation for improving compliance standards? And then the problem for future commission could be getting more granular on that.
So we could hit the easy button on that one, say that the commission had already agreed that we should make it a traffic infraction to not follow DOE rule and follow statutes. With that in mind, if Wyndham 2159 does indeed pass, we do have now a mechanism of compliance from law enforcement. It's not great, but there was nothing before. Now, if we're dealing with an incident, I hate to have a crash be the reason, but that's what happens. There's a crash, there's an investigation, that's when there's going to be enforcement. And I think with the districts and drivers recognizing there's a traffic violation, we'll see an increase in compliance. If that we had all agreed should be part of our recommendation is to make it a traffic violation. So we have accomplished
We've
something.
got some compliance, but then I guess it's monitoring.
Yeah, right. Yes. And there was a few different ideas on monitoring, but I think that requires additional resources regardless of who's responsible for it, whether it's the state police from a regulatory standpoint where we already do inspections, school buses, do we do compliance checks while we're there, similar to that we do for commercial vehicles. We already have people that are able and willing to do that, but they add it to the existing resource, I think would be challenging. I don't think we could take on 250 districts and do compliance checks at the same time we're doing school bus inspections. But with a couple people, increase your headcount by 2 within our organization, we certainly could manage compliance by doing the same CR reduce we would do at any other commercial location. It just, you just pull their records and we have a chat side by side and say, show me what you've got for your driver training. Let's see what drivers you have. Have they all had it? What's your checkoff list look like? What's your procedure? How about your students? Are there any students that missed this training, and how do you go after the ones that weren't there? And you'll tell us, and you're going to say, well, no, they weren't here that day. So what do we do with absent students? You have to get everybody sort of, and generally that conversation will build compliance without writing any tickets.
Well, how many school districts are actually taking down all the names of the students that are getting their training? I mean, we do our training, and like one day my driver will do go over everything. The next day he'll actually do a emergency exit, and I don't know if how to get every student's name that wasn't there. He'll mark down, and students may go 3 days a week here, 2 days a week here, and so some of them are getting them twice, but some may get missed. So it's going to be hard to get full compliant. One thing, like you have high school students that never ride bus, and all of a sudden they go on a field trip.
Right, but it is already a requirement.
Right.
So we understand you'll never get full compliance, but I think we have to recognize that it's already required. And so if there's going to be somebody that's going to do these investigations or to hold people to a certain standard or hold them accountable, that's going to be part of the conversation is what happens to those you miss. Because like the New York model that was sent to us, every student has to be trained on it regardless if you ride the bus or not. You got to have that training day, so get it in there and take attendance. And whoever is not there is going to have a makeup. There just has to be a mechanism to ensure that you're following the rule. And I'm going really deep into detail, but that's what you do for compliance. That's part of the CR is we ask you, how about this? How about that? We see it all the time when somebody doesn't meet the standards for the federal motor carrier safety regulations. And we're interviewing them like, oh, we don't do that. Oh, we don't keep those records. And so it's an education. And we say, well, okay, we're not going to give you a ticket because you didn't do it. Right. So I don't see that unless there's a refusal to cooperate when you're trying to get compliance, if you say, I really need to do this, Wayne, you're like, I'm not doing that. Well, you really need, the law says you have to do it. Well, yeah, but it's really inconvenient for us. I understand that, but everyone else has figured out how to do it.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be us, by the way. I only throw it out there because we have that type of service investigation unit anyway, that the commercial vehicle enforcement. I hate putting everything on DOE, and we have so far. That's the only reason that
Let's pile on.
I'm spreading it out a little, say we can. But I think DOE can also help with that monitoring if they had additional staffing.
So
it wouldn't be so hard all.
Yeah, I want to give Wayne and Chris a chance to kind of talk about how you manage sort of like ensuring that students are trained. And I do think there's also some consideration because one of the pieces that we have to also recommend is how do we communicate with families? And so I think the moment that we are, providing from the Department of Education, here is a standard letter that you could use before your bus safety days, sending to parents, here's the notification, here's something you put out on your social media page. Wednesday is school bus safety day. This means that the routes may be a little bit slowed down because they are going to do an evacuation, whatever. But I want to kind of turn that over to you because I want to make a recommendation. It's going to be compliant with the law, something that we could also monitor, but also something that is reasonable and practical and can actually be carried out.
Well, I think that's exactly the reasonable, practical piece, right? And I think that we may have part of this discussion a while ago when we talked about this, but when you talk about who you're training, right? It's, sitting there when you make regulations, it's easy to say, yeah, we're going to train all kids and we all high five and walk away. I think all of us can sit here and say that's not reasonable or practical, right? And so I think what should the actual wording say? Like, does it say like make all reasonable efforts to train, the entire student body, right? And I know that's hard to enforce, right? From an enforcement side, that's very difficult because then you have to get numbers and what's reasonable, what isn't, But is there some language that can go in there, right? As to how we, or you could say you must train all students. For students that weren't physically present, the district must provide like an asynchronous option or something where we can send a video out, right, to parents, or provide an asynchronous option to parents. So that way you can say, hey, we train 192 of the 200 kids that go to this one school. And then there was, the gap that we didn't train. We provided the school that information or the parents that information. We posted on our website and sent a mass email out saying if your student didn't attend, you need to do this training here and sign this form and send it back to us, right? So maybe there's an option, the way you can get to it. The other thing too is if you were going to have a compliance piece, in a lot of regulation and compliance, sometimes the inspection the first year will be considered a grace period, where it's an educational piece, and then you say as of 2027, 2028, whenever that the year is, then enforcement action will be taken, and then you say, hey, we want to get everybody to this standard. We're going to give you the option. The experts are going to come down and talk to you and look at your books and say we're going to. But there's not that pressure like, oh my God, like I'm going to get a ticket, I'm going to get fined, this, that, the other thing, and it's less adversarial too. People that are coming down to do the inspection, but we should know effort moving forward.
Right. I like the idea of the form, and at the same time, going to and what if nobody signs it? You know what I mean? I know what it's like for trying to chase down forms. I want to hear from Wayne. Then I have a thought. I want to just kind of chime in about thinking about something else.
Well, one thing is, what are we training? Firstly, because if we're doing like an airline before every flight, they're given a quick little bleep like I do on my sports buses. Is that go via training? We just mentioned, the escape routes and stuff like that and there is a difference between training a 4 or 5 year old and training a high school student. So we're going to have to do some kind of different, what type of training are we doing to different age groups? Are we doing elementary, require a half-hour training, and your high school students can go with just the quick little blip.
Yeah.
So that's my biggest thing is, and then I know you can get more students if, I have for 1 week, the driver does that little thing on his bus. He just does like an airplane training. And then we give extra training to the younger students.
I think that it's, first of all, I really appreciate bringing that point up, Wade, is that there are developmental differences. I don't know if you've noticed between a first grader and a 12th grader. Sometimes they're not as different as you think, but I do think, I'm thinking a lot about what is required for evacuation drills in a school. And the reason that in our state statute, we talk about those evacuation drills in terms of they're a different number depending on the grade level of the children. But the idea of having, you know, a total of 10 for, I think it's K4 or K6, is again, you may miss kids. They may miss one of those trainings. But what happens is you train people so it's sort of their muscle memory. They know how to do this thing. I think all the time of a former legislator who had been in the state house probably 20 years ago, where there was a fire alarm that went off in the state capitol on the day that fourth graders were visiting. They had about 300 fourth graders who all stood up, turned, followed their teacher right out. She's like, the legislators had no idea what to do, so we followed the fourth graders. And so it's kind of like you build in the muscle memory. And so instead of us trying to figure out which students were absent, do we look at the number of trainings that are required to include students so that in the earlier grades, they get to go through it a couple of times, you know, instead of just twice, you know, one in the fall or one in the spring. Do we instead look at, we train students multiple times in elementary school, and I'm pressure testing this, and I want people who know and are dealing with this to be like, that's just not practical, it'll break us. But I'm thinking about, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier to say, Cheryl was here for the fall drill, but she wasn't here for the spring drill. And now I got to send a form home to see if Cheryl and her family have watched the video, and I got to chase that down. I just think I don't know that we have infrastructure in our different districts to be able to monitor that reasonably.
And I'd be shocked if people actually did it at that level,
Yeah.
statewide. I'd be surprised. Yeah, maybe the form's not the right thing. I just,
Right,
you know, I'm
no,
just spitballing.
But it gets to that compliance. It gets to like, what are we doing for compliance, and do we get to that? And I understand where we want to go here. We don't get so into the details, but I also am thinking, if we think more in terms of if we're talking about how do we monitor and know if all the students have been trained, do we instead say students will participate in trainings multiple times so that you have a greater likelihood of making sure that all students have been there for at least a couple of them?
So the National Congress recommendation says at least once during each school semester, each pupil transported from home to school. So it kind of deals with those that don't ride the bus, right? It's those that are transported.
Yeah.
So your number will be a little bit lower. You set the standard. We hope for voluntary compliance. You're never going to get full compliance, but we can't change our standard as a result. But I think we're really, if we decide that it's once a year, twice a year, or once a semester, as the Congress recommends, it's each pupil, you do your best. We don't expect perfection from anybody. We know that. We don't see it when we set speed limits. We don't see it when we have stop signs and red lights. I mean, we do our best, and we hope that we're going to get voluntary compliance. Again, I don't see the enforcement mechanism being out there writing tickets. We have to cooperate with each other and figure this out. But each student should be trained. And it's really, really critical with some insight, some knowledge. There could be students that don't get the training that the ones that wind up in the tragedies. So we can't say it's going to be most of them will do our best. We really just have to say they all do. And then if there's the one or two that slip through the cracks, that's what happens. It's a terrible way to look at it. But I think we have to say each student do our best to meet that standard. With the state police, we say every trooper shall. And at the end of the year, when you don't, you're decertified. So that again, it's really hard with kids, but we have to track it somehow. You have to create the standard. You have to track it. So that's my soapbox speech. Is I think we got to put something down, find the best way to enforce it.
I think, like I said, I think you could do that, and I think you could, by doing the training for the masses, and then you know what your delta is in there, and you those kids that in the gap that didn't get it, you provide. Say, hey, we provided it, we sent it out. It doesn't necessarily need to be the parent needs to sign off on it, but we sent it out, we provided it. The district can say we've done everything within reason, right? That we could try to do to train the student.
So
Because there are those kids that drive to school,
Right,
and
right, right.
then they ride to sports, and they just ride to the Vokes, and then they drive home. And it's so hard to capture those students, right?
So when we talk about the training that the department is going to contract to have developed, the training will also include student training that is developmentally appropriate for the different grade levels. And have that as an available resource so that when schools are promoting, hey, this is our bus safety week, or we're doing our trainings this week, parents, please check out this link provided to you by the Department of Education for safe transport. And now we're also addressing, this other piece of the executive order, which calls for us to make sure that we are talking about how do we disseminate information. But if it is the responsibility of the Department of Education to work with a contractor to put those trainings together so that then when you're saying, no, we do the trainings for all of our students, and we also allow them to access these other modules.
Yeah, there's a company that does it. The school bus safety company is a company. I don't know if you've ever seen them before. They offer a whole bunch of modules. I previewed some of their stuff, and it's pretty good. They do a road crossing thing for kids. It has like cartoons and stuff. They have one for different grade levels for pre-K kids, the middle school, the high school, there's like 3 different modules for different ages. And some are cartoon based, some are a little more like, there's teenagers talking, hey, this is what I do when I cross, and it's pretty good. So I think that there's some opportunity for that, to be able to have somebody contract. The challenge is that some of our practices are so different across the school districts, for example, how we cross kids, right? Or how we do certain things. Evacuation should be pretty standard, right? But like, if you're talking about training how to cross the street, some might give a wave, some might give a nod or something like that. And so that's why I didn't use like this company. I was really considering using the district, but they teach to like a wave versus a thumbs up or something. So that's the thing. So like, you're right. And so that everybody does a little different. So I didn't ultimately go with that, but would be very helpful,
I really like the structured yearly training for students, but I wrote down, I'm going to talk with my transportation director, because I like the idea, especially at the elementary level. So many kids don't take the bus, but when they go on a field trip, I think a quick safety check by the driver that day, like you do for athletics, makes a lot of sense. We have kids that have never ridden a bus, right? Because their parents might not want them on the bus for a
Or they
I
don't
actually
have that
brought
on
one of my-
any area where their transportation is provided.
Where's Buster the bus?
What's that?
Where's Buster?
I have one. I have the Northern Chapters, Buster,
There used to be 2.
yeah, there's 2.
Where is it?
Northern Chapter has one, and
Couldn't you have a bus present at the school during the school day? And then I know in elementary school, you have your homeroom and your teacher.
We do that for our regular schedule. All kids go through,
Yeah,
so we do that.
called sheet dipping.
But I'm thinking more along the lines of as a nice little add-on. Whenever we take kids out for a field trip, I think because they could be mixed with other classes and things. So just as a reminder of what the expectations are, really, so expectations about proper conduct as well at the same time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we do have those regularly scheduled evacuation drills. This
It
would
was,
be an
it was
add-on.
just a question of documenting whether they've received training, at least that initial training, we were doing it, like by homeroom. I remember as a kid, that's what we did. And so your homeroom teacher is already taking attendance for the day and can tell you which kids were out. That would allow you to figure out who needs to have a makeup day potentially. And then you just kind of, you could rotate the classroom so there's not a whole bunch of kids waiting their turn out there. I would assume that principal could.
it's pretty easy to get the younger kids because the teachers are real receptive on giving school bus training. You get up into the high school level, it's hard to get, teachers don't want to let you come in and do school bus training in their curriculum hours. So you kind of have to do that on the bus.
Everything's harder with things.
And the concept that you shared that I would like to tag on in our district would not qualify for actual true student training because there are so many other elements that would not be part of that quick conversation. So I don't want to imply that it would cover that.
No, but I do it just like the field trip side of it, just because you don't know who knows how to open a window or whatever. It's a 5-minute thing that they do before a field trip or whatever.
I like it. I think we should fund a video of that being done professionally, and that can be shared. That can be part of the training. So that way, if you can't make it on the
It's on
bus,
full training, but
it's a link. You can go look at it. The parents can go look at it with them. At least you're offering it. You're saying, listen, watch this.
Yeah.
Because you're right. You see it every time you're on a plane and you listen to the person. Maybe the second, and after that you stop, but they don't stop playing it.
Right.
You're going to hear it. You can ignore it if you want to, but their liability has been mitigated by the fact that they do it every single time. So if you had a video maybe that you did periodically, orientation, don't you? I mean, you got to come back in for faculty workshops and things that you guys could kind of critique that and figure out if it's worth.
The only
What
issue
you're not doing it.
the ones on the airline are model specific to the plane that you're in, because your exit locations are different.
Right.
So every bus, it would have to be a suite of, for a Bluebird.
Yeah.
Pretty much
Please,
all
like,
Planes are
three-
pretty, they'll say maybe under your seat, it maybe above you, or the X may be ahead of you or behind you. I think you can get generic enough on that. I think some of the things.
I mean, we
the
have
windows all open the same way.
pretty much,
Pretty much across the brand. There's enough commonality. You can show a few different instances in it, but I'm sure some smart person that does videos and training could get that in there pretty easily.
you know, on a conventional bus, the door is always in the rear of the bus for the emergency exit door. On your rear engines are on the side. Some maybe have both side and a
You
rear.
could show a few different examples. I think
Yeah.
that would be pretty easy to get around. But I do think that, like, as part of our earlier our previous discussions, that we do need to look at that language where it says drills, because that's so specific about like bringing people onto a bus and doing it, and then incorporating the training into there somehow, so we have a little more flexibility. Because I'll be honest with you, I think adding that flexibility doesn't lower our standard, and in fact, it encompasses more opportunities to train people than just saying drills.
Right, and I think right now it says each student transported to and from home, blah, blah, blah. The school bus must be instructed in riding safety practices proper, so it's instructed in. And so we could deliver that in a number of different ways. So when we're looking at 81 and talking about I don't know that we're making a lot of recommended changes to 81 in terms of, sounds like we're not saying we'll add more training required of the students. I think we could add in communication, a section to communicate with families, best practice communicating with families, or something about, sharing information related to the training requirements for students. Because families would want them, especially if they're walking with their young ones, to the buses to know sort of about a safe approach, about, the danger zone and some of those pieces. So I think that the way we would write that into a recommendation in the report, and then the way we write it into 81 would be, I think, really that schools will share with the families when those trainings for the students will occur, so families are aware, and the department will provide resources for the content of what needs to be shared. I do think that it would also be helpful that we continue to reference back in 81 that the department will be providing and reviewing training standards frequently, and will be updating those, because I think that's another piece that is likely to be an ongoing cost. It is not just going to be the initial development, but there's going to need to be, a review consistent with the frequency of the adoption of the National Congress. And so if the National Congress is every 2 years, then we should be doing that. It was usually every 5, right? 5. They've changed it to 3. Okay. So when we're talking about standards for safety in the curriculum, the checklists, that I think should be referenced in 81, and then referred back to frequently to say that and the department will be reviewing those checklists. So that way we're not going back into rulemaking every time, but it references the checklists and the training materials that will be updated consistent with the changes to the National Congress.
I like that the DOE will create the curriculum, or the commission, if it's ongoing, whatever you decide, but that would be really good. And then you create it each year, whatever you think is that best practice. That's what's shared. Everybody gets the same training.
So looking at chapter 81 and recognizing the discussions we've had about training, The last piece I would say, we just haven't really dug into a lot, but I think we hit on it a bit last week enough that we can make some recommendations, is that the department will also identify training requirements for the transportation directors or for people responsible for the training of the bus drivers, even if that district doesn't have them. And so we include that piece in there just as a reference that that's a whole group that needs to also have some training. There's never been anything specified for the number of hours that a director would have to engage in any kind of training. And so again, I guess I'm asking, does that need to be added into 81?
Yeah. Problem is, you got directors like myself that have been doing it for years, and then you got a new director that's coming in. The new director, I should be saying the new director has X amount of hours or whatever. I mean,
I think that's one where certainly leveraging some asynchronous learning is important. Like giving a time frame that, somebody newly hired has, 12 months to comply or something, get whatever the right time frame is, because you might hire the right person and say they don't necessarily have the credential. I think they do have teachers sometimes, right, where they give them some time to get a license or something like that in the state, or they, but there's certainly.
I don't know if you would actually want a certification process for.
Or whatever the case may be,
but,
get the training.
I mean, there should be a minimum training.
Yeah.
For like a principal or a superintendent or a teacher, 90 hours, I believe, of training.
Yeah.
Every 5 year cycle.
Yeah.
A college course, for example, counts as 45 hours. If I built it into a plan, I could count these hours towards my new learning. But yeah, so there are requirements, but those are for certification.
Right.
You all
Right.
don't have a certification.
You can be a certified director, transportation director through NAPT. They have courses that are already developed, and then you take a test at the end of it. I've had all the courses. I've never taken the test.
It's a long process though, too, right?
Yeah, well, I think I've been 10 years taking those tests. They offer them at the MAPT conference on Directors Day. We have a day that directors, and we offer those courses there. I've taken all of them. Chris, I know you've taken
A couple.
So how about for the purposes of our recommendation, that we sort of say, the commission will look at training requirements for directors? Because I think that we don't want to act quickly here just to be like, okay, we're at the end of the meeting, so let's just tack these on. Recognize, I think we need to really understand just the landscape. And we've got to think about folks who've been doing this for more than 5 years. We've got to think about folks who have been drivers in the past, the folks who haven't been. We've got to think of, there's just a lot to consider before we just try to staple on an initial.
Diverse responsibilities that director might have, the multiple hats that they wear. They're not always solely dedicated to transportation.
And we have to if we're gonna say, 16 hours, it's like, okay, where are they gonna get the 16 hours? But,
One thing that I don't think should be part of the requirement, but it might be a way to grow the profession. No different than the State Department of Ed supporting nationally board certified teachers, which has nothing to do with local districts, but it's a lot of work. But if you get nationally board certified, the state provides an annual stipend for those individuals because they've gone through all that rigorous work. Maybe similarly, again, unrelated to the commission's work, but maybe there could be a recommendation to provide a supplement directly to those or to the districts and then to the directors if they are nationally certified.
Well, that was part of what I was thinking about was talking about the Road Scholar, is that, in the same way we do the National Board Certified Teachers, do we create sort of salary supplement that goes along with these? If a driver gets a certain level of expertise, sort of like badging, Same thing with the transportation director. I think it would be likely very difficult for us to get a transportation director to that kind of level of certification if there's not formal certification through chapter 115. I think that would be likely where they would kind of be like, how do we know? But if they went to the national one that's already established, then maybe there is a salary supplement. But I do suspect our state board would want to have some say about that.
I think there's only 3 in the state right now that are nationally certified.
But it could grow the
It
profession.
provides a future path.
It would look good on
Thought he was,
They're all retired now.
they're all retired. I think there's,
Basically, either there or getting close to it.
Yeah, Missy said she's been working on it.
Yeah.
for years.
Yeah, I have to just sit for the exam.
So Missy's jumping in here. Sorry.
There she is.
I just have to sit for the exam, but it is, like you said, Megan, it's very, very time consuming. And unless there's a set standard, there's really not a whole lot of incentive to do that. And it's a huge expense because a lot of those classes need to be taken at the national conference level. And that's at the expense of districts right now.
So how about we just put like a note, chapter 81, you got section 4, and then there's subsections 1 and 2 for driver training. And what's 3 is transportation director shall meet minimum training standards created by Department of Education or the commission, whatever you think is appropriate language. And then at least it'll be effective. You won't have to go back to create a new rule again, because you're going to have to submit this for recommended rule change. And whatever it is that you create the annual standard, they'll have to. So
you could do something like I just did my IPM certification yesterday. And on your online, there was 4 courses to take. And then you took the test, you hit submit.
What's your camera?
IPM,
IPM.
integrated pest management.
Oh, okay, that's okay. Too many acronyms. But I recall pest management being a thing.
But I like it. I mean, I think leveraging the technology is essential. But if you create it in your rule that they must meet the standards that you create, then it's something.
Is there?
Because it is there right now at all.
So what I'd like to do right now is go back to the agenda and sort of touch on sort of where we are in terms of each of the executive order requirements. And I think that, believe it or not, we have, I think with the last piece about talking about communication to families, I think we have addressed each one of the requirements outlined in the executive order. By just sort of the last piece here talking about Rule Chapter 81, I think we have included the elements for any kind of recommended changes to Rule Chapter 81. And so that covers the first section, reviewing current standards, statutes, and then C was identifying changes for improvement. Bus specifications we really addressed in the second meeting of the commission, and much of that is predicated on the work that was done with LD 2159. Training, that's really where we've been talking for the last 2.5 meetings. And I think that we'll sort of address that and we've got a number of recommendations, including the checklists, including, who is going to be creating those, including the need to recommend funding. In terms of monitoring and compliance, which is really not explicitly trained there, talked about there, but I do think it's one that we will have to sort of address with G. Talking about sort of compliance measures and then also making a recommendation around if monitoring is going to be required by the Department of Education, then or other agencies, funding will be needed to pay for staff members, and that will likely we'll include that if it's okay with the commissions in our recommendations to the report. Finally, updated best practices. I think that ties naturally into the training. What I think we'll be asking for when we talk about the RFP for someone to create training modules will be what is the best practice. I think I heard the example of when you're crossing students, do you waive them? Do you give all of those pieces will be that sort of what I think will be put together in the training materials, and that will be sort of associated with best practices, and then turning the page, talking about communication with families and students. And I think that that's largely going to come through some training resources, as well as communication models, like letters that could be used to share with families ahead of trainings. Talking with districts and SAUs about practices that they use. I know there's a lot of training that has already been put together in our by MAPT, but also by our SAUs, and we'll want to incorporate that to make sure that when we hire someone to kind of put those training together is based on what is being done. So we're not just introducing something that's done in Missouri. I'm from Missouri, so that's why I can say it like that. And it is Maine specific. What we know is already sort of in practice, and that then we would make sure that our schools are communicating that information to our families as well, since they're a key player in teaching our students and talking about those things. So with that said, I want to make sure I'm asking members of the commission as well as members of the public if there are other recommendations related to what is in the executive order that we need to add to make sure it's called out in the recommendations in the report. And then we'll spend a few minutes just talking about how we're going to do some of the report writing and the timeline for then having us review and sort of sign off before we submit to the governor. So any additions based on sort of what we've talked about, any things that you're in your mind, you want to make sure that we call out and explicitly address in the report.
I think for me, great conversations about a lot of broad topics.
Well, I have to confess, I haven't had a chance to review the draft. I have skimmed through it. Very impressive so far. I think a ton of work has been done. I think it's very well documented. I may have a couple of things to add here and there as I really spend some time on it. But I don't think there's anything that I missed or failed to address. We really looked at what was important. We had some great discussions about each bullet point, and I feel like most of them can be combined into probably just 2 or 3 anyway. So certainly report back the way that they had requested. But I can think of something we haven't really tried to hammer through and come up with at least some solutions. So suggestions. So I got that.
Yeah, same thing. When do we, I guess some question I come up, when do we have to have all our edits and things?
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, okay.
Well,
okay. You know, they're saying if you only have a minute, then it only takes a minute, right? You know, so okay.
I love that you said that.
It's like, wow, that's
I'm
awesome.
gonna be like, yeah, okay. So next week.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think, so what we had been really hoping for was an early turnaround. So we did not want this to go until April 30th, which is the deadline. And I know that I think originally, way back in meeting 1, we were talking about the need to have this done early April so that the transportation committee would be able to see what we're recommending. But then Ledge Council and such said, nope, you're going to be done sooner than that. So that pressure is off. But I would say that I think we really should be looking at wrapping up all of the writing no later than April 20th or so. And that's just generous. I think we're pretty good shape. So what I'd love to have from this group are edits in no later than next Friday, the 10th. That'll give us time to, and I know Jen is on, she's taking notes. Hi, Jen. To incorporate some of what we've been talking about in terms of the recommendations into different parts. Things that I need everybody on the commission to do is if you don't have access to the live version, the shared version, please make sure that you're communicating with me. And worst case scenario, we're going to have to shift to a platform where we all can work because I want to make sure members of the commission are able to see edits in real time. And so if we're aiming for edits to be done by next Friday, then that'll actually we can move it back to Thursday. That way then maybe by Tuesday, the 20, let me think, next week would be the 7th, the 10th. And then if we could have until the 17th or so, then kind of going back and forth with folks. 20th is Patriots Day. So if we could aim for it being done, I'm not even looking at calendar, so I'll just my brain. A little muddled. edits in next week, that's the 10th. And then try to have the final sort of picked over by the 17th and ready to submit by the 21st.
Fall Friday.
That gives a little cushion.
That seems reasonable. Guess I'm not the one right.
Oh, Chris was the one who was like, I'll do it tomorrow. Like, yeah.
I think that's timeline sounds great. And I have one question or comment. And it might be captured properly already, but obviously there were two tragedies. We want to address that. We want to promote safety. I also think that there's a great deal of fantastic work that happens day in and day out with dedicated folks. So I wonder if there should be some comments about that really does capture that the state of Maine is fortunate to have really great drivers, really supportive. That it's spoken to a little bit about being the first contact, the last contact of the day. But I know that I currently have a driver that's out ill, and it's devastating to that individual because they want to be with their kids every day. And we have drivers throughout the state that really have taken the tragedies to heart. It's really been really impactful. And my only one concern would be that they would feel that the work that's really about making improvements might question how dedicated and focused they are as a collective. Just a thought. There's a way to kind of.
I so appreciate that you brought that up because when I was looking at it, the context portion sort of spells pieces out, but I think we've got an opportunity in the acknowledgement section and then to basically reiterate in the context section. But I think that is an explicit call out that we have to do. We have to be really clear that, drivers are deeply committed individuals. And we also have to acknowledge the context that it's, they have skills that that are highly transferable and they could go out and make a lot more money in, hauling and doing some other things without nearly sort of like complex emotional and sort of heaviness of the responsibility that we all know that they carry. So I think that's really helpful. And Jen and I will kind of think through, like, does it make sense to go in the acknowledgement section, the context?
I'm not sure where it goes.
Yeah.
I just know in my district, there was some piling on, like the number of complaints that came forward.
Yeah.
As we were trying to also navigate all the red light violations
Yeah.
and things like that. But early on, there were a lot of folks that, and I think you saw it on social media everywhere, and it really made it hard for a lot of our drivers that are just tremendous people. And they just simply need some additional supports and resources. I said that last week. And I think that when people pick this up, it'll be important to recognize their efforts.
Yeah. People don't realize a lot of times too what bus drivers do for kids. Some of them give them coats, they
Yeah.
bring them food because they don't have much. I mean, we used to go pick some kids up, one of the families to go bring them for a shower before school started because they have to.
Yeah.
They go above and beyond. They're really, really good.
My kids always kind of been great drivers. I know Chris has a couple that I see here often. Brenda and Bus 7. They got their thumbs up. They're really supportive. You can just see the parents are engaging. Really good people throughout the state.
They are. Yeah.
And Steve, I appreciate that coming from somebody other than a transportation person. that was recognized. I do appreciate you saying that.
Well, I want to just provide an opportunity to Rice, a member of the public, and anyone online. We currently have one other member of the public online. Any comments that you want to share before we
I'll
adjourn?
just mention that when I became a bus driver, my superintendent told me, "You're gonna have 6 eyes." I said, "What are you talking about?" "You're gonna have 2 on the road, 2 on the kids in the back, and 2 behind you." And It wasn't too far from wrong.
No,
But I had some great kids and I volunteer on the food bank in Bodenham, and I had a fella come up to me and he says, you know, you used to drive my bus. I didn't have a clue who he was. You know, he's got to be in his 40s now, you know.
they look a little different, don't they?
Yes,
He knew who you were,
huh?
but he knew who you were.
He knew who I was.
That's the impact. of
Didn't
the
forget
driver.
me, all right?
That's right.
No, and all the.
I said, I could be mean if I had to be.
All the kids
But
that
it's-
now, and their kids are.
It's amazing how many good bus drivers we have in this state. And we've got some that are there for their paychecks and some that make mistakes, but it's a real good crew everywhere.
Right, well, I want to thank everyone on the commission. It's been truly a pleasure and really an honor to do this work. I want to once again acknowledge the two deaths that, you know, are unbelievably tragic, but that I think, and I hope are going to yield some good learning and safer experiences for all children. So I want to thank you for your dedication. This was a little bit more than I think anybody thought it was going to be when we first started, but I really appreciate your time and your care and your thoughtfulness. So thank you very much. And if I have a motion for adjournment, Steve moved and second, Wayne. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.